The guards gestured for Silence and Frost to pass through the double doors and into the waiting court, before the throne of Lionstone XIV.
The chains are just a formality.
A rather heavy formality, Your Majesty. May I inquire as to why we are here?
We were rather annoyed with you in the Investigator. You lost us a perfectly good starship, and you failed to bring us the head of that most wretched traitor, Owen Deathstalker. We wanted his head very much. We were going to stick it on a spike right here at court, so that everyone could see what happens to those who dare defy us, whatever their status. We were also planning to have you both killed in slow, painful ways as a sign to those who dared fail us, but we changed our mind. We have a use for you. We hereby reinvest you in your previous ranks. We give you a new ship, the Dauntless, fitted with our new star drive. You will go to the planet Grendel and open the vaults of the Sleepers.
A shocked gasp rippled through the court. Everyone remembered what happened the last time a starship made contact with Grendel. The planet had seemed empty, peaceful, perfect for colonization. But deep in the ground, the investigatory team had found the remains of a vast alien city, long abandoned, and massive steel vaults, ancient almost beyond measurement. They opened one of the vaults, and the Sleepers awoke. Hideous alien creatures, nightmares in flesh and blood, they wiped out the entire landing party in a matter of minutes. The Empire sent down seasoned attack troops, battle espers, even adjusted men. They all died.
Might I inquire why we're opening this particular can of worms again, Your Majesty?
Of course, Captain. You're going to open the vaults one at a time and discover, by whatever means you deem necessary, how to tame and train the Sleepers. You will have unlimited access to funds, men, and weaponry. Call on whatever you need to do the job. It is our intention to use the Sleepers as shock troops in our coming conflict with the two newly discovered alien species. Any questions?
Do I have time to make a will before I go?
Defiance Audio presents Simon R. Green's Deathstalker. Narrated by Richard Rowan. With performances by Nanette Savard, Colleen Delaney, and Terrence Aselford. Episode 3, Under the Ashes, the City. John Silence, once again a captain in the Imperial fleet by Her Majesty's pleasure, sat stiffly in the command chair on the bridge of his new ship, the Dauntless, and tried unsuccessfully to get comfortable. It wasn't that there was anything actually wrong with the chair, it was just so new, like everything else. It didn't give in the right places or make allowances for his habitual gestures like the old one had. But that chair was long gone with the rest of the good ship Darkwind. She'd been his ship for many years, and a good ship, too. Silence snorted silently. Here he was with a new ship and a second chance he'd had no right to expect or hope for, and all he could do was find fault. Well, thought Silence, do what you're best at. That's what I always say. But he had to admit the Dauntless was something special, even if she was still fresh from the star docks, all sparkling clean and completely untested. If she lived up to even half the claims the engineers made for her, she'd be the fastest, best gunship in the fleet, and a genuine wonder of the galaxy. She had the new star drive, more disruptor cannon than any ship before, and force shields powerful enough to survive a dive into a sun. The Dauntless was a whole damn navy in itself, and Silence wasn't blind to the trust the Empress had placed in him by giving him the command. Any other captain might have been tempted to just take the ship and run for the rim, to build a small empire of his own, secure in the knowledge it would be years before any similar ships could come after him. But Lionstone had known he wouldn't do that. She had given him back his life and his commission, when she needn't have given him either, because she trusted him. And now he was her man, blood and bone and spirit, until they were both dead and gone to dust. But until then, he was the new captain of a very new ship, where nothing could be trusted until it had been thoroughly tested and tried and proved reliable. Fine claims were all very well, but Silence reserved judgment. Engineers had a tendency to over-enthusiasm, especially when it wasn't their butts on the firing line. Besides, Silence knew where the new star drive had come from. The engineers had derived it from the drive in the alien ship he'd found crash-landed on Unseelie barely a year ago. Silence supposed it was just possible the Stardocs now had a full working knowledge of the alien technology, but just in case, he made it a point to know where the nearest escape pod was at any given moment. That was the other side to the Empress's appointing him captain of the Dauntless. If nothing else, he was entirely expendable. He deliberately put that thought aside and concentrated on the view screen before him. The Dauntless had dropped out of hyperspace and taken up an orbit around the planet Grendel some 2 hours ago, and he still couldn't get any sensible data out of his brand new sensors. The information they were giving him was questionable where it wasn't obscure, and no bloody use to him at all. Practically every question he put to his computers came back insufficient data, and the ship's AI was sulking because he'd shouted at it. But he couldn't in good faith put off planetfall much longer. The Empress's orders had been quite explicit. He was to locate and open the vaults of the Sleepers and subjugate or destroy whatever creatures he found in them. Nothing new in that. It was the Empire's standard attitude to all aliens. But the aliens on Grendel, or rather buried deep beneath its surface, were different. Vicious, unnatural killing machines. They'd slaughtered the last Empire team to encounter them. Some fool opened a vault, and that was that. Hopefully, things would be different this time. Firstly, he had some idea of what he was getting into, and secondly, when he finally got around to opening up a vault, he was going to be backed up by a full company of 50 Marines, 10 Battle Espers, and 20 Wampir. Which should give him an edge, if nothing else. Silence was frankly surprised that there were still 20 Wampir left in the service. Their uses were limited, they were expensive to maintain, they disturbed the hell out of anyone who had to work with them, and by now, everyone knew all about plasma babies. And that was all he needed on a new ship with a new crew, a new addictive drug to tempt his men. They were probably already building illicit stills and cooking up new battle drugs in the labs, just to see if they could get away with it under a new captain. Which was possibly why the Empire had insisted on supplying him with a new security officer, V. Stelmach by name. He hadn't volunteered his first name, and Silence hadn't pressed him in case it was something embarrassing. Vernon, Valentine, Violet? Big, broad, close-mouthed, and entirely humorless, the security officer was never far from the captain or the investigator, keeping a watchful eye. Just a little reminder that the two of them still had to prove themselves. Silence did his best not to notice. He glanced across at Frost, standing rock-solid at parade rest beside his chair, her fierce gaze fixed on the view of Grendel before them. He hadn't had much chance to talk to her since Lionstone had pardoned them both. There'd been too much to do getting the ship ready to depart. The nature of their jobs kept them apart, and besides, he wasn't sure what he would have said anyway. The investigator had saved his life, but he didn't know why. Anyone else, he might have made a few educated guesses, but investigators had none of the softer emotions. Their training saw to that. There were those who said the investigators were as inhuman as the aliens they studied, that there was no room in them for anything but cold, calculated killing. In which case, she'd feel right at home on Grendel. Silence sighed quietly and gave his full attention to the view screen. Grendel filled the screen, a gray, featureless ball of ash, hiding secrets. The planet had a surface once, complete with the decaying husks of deserted alien cities and machinery, but all that was gone, lost or destroyed when the Imperial fleet scorched the planet from orbit to be sure of destroying the terrible creatures that had boiled out of the vault of the Sleepers. Grendel had been under full quarantine ever since, and 6 star cruisers hung permanently in orbit over the planet to ensure that nothing and no one got in or out. Silence had thought that something of an overreaction, but that was before he'd seen the surviving records of the first contact team, and saw how they died. Now he was just grateful the ships were there. Not that they'd actually back him up, even if things went disastrously wrong a second time, but they would ensure that whatever happened, not one alien creature would escape from the planet, even if they had to scorch it again. Silence shivered briskly, as though someone had just walked over his grave, and put that thought aside too. First things first, check that the quarantine remained secure for the record. He had his communications officer raise the command ship of the quarantine, and the cold, calm features of Captain Bartok of the Defiant filled the view screen. Bartok the Butcher. In his time, he'd overseen the scorching of 3 worlds and put down a dozen rebellions, by whatever means he thought necessary. A personal favorite of the Iron Bitch, and just the kind of man you needed to run a quarantine like this. Silence nodded to him courteously.
Last contact before we make planetfall, Captain Bartok. Just checking that everything's still secure. For the record.
Bartok sniffed and fixed Silence with a cold, unyielding stare.
For the record, then. Quarantine remains unbroken. Not one ship has survived to make planetfall since this operation was set up, and there has been absolutely no trace of alien activity on the planet itself. My orders are to stand by and observe as you send your people down in pinnaces. They will disembark, and the pinnaces will return to the Dauntless, where they will be thoroughly inspected by my people. So if you do let loose something you can't control, it will have no means of leaving the planet's surface. Understand me, Captain Silence. You and all your people are completely expendable. I have been expressly ordered that under no circumstances am I to assist or help you in any way once you have made planetfall. Whatever happens, once you're down there, you're on your own. And in the most extreme case, acting on my judgment alone, I am to destroy the Dauntless completely, if there seems any risk that she might be contaminated. Have I made myself clear, Captain?
Utterly. I've seen the records of the first team. Take no chances. Silence out.
He sensed as much as heard Frost stirring at his side while Bartok's face disappeared from the view screen, replaced by Grendel's enigmatic surface. He turned slightly to look at her.
Problem, investigator?
Frost sniffed.
Thinks he's so hot. All he's ever done is give orders from the rear. Never killed in hot blood in his life, like as not. Darling of the Academy, but no guts. No real guts.
Not to worry, investigator. We've gone into sticky situations before without any backup.
At least then we didn't have to worry about being shot in the back by our own side.
She flicked a quick glance at the security officer, who was quietly studying the most recent sensor readings at the science console.
We're not even entirely safe on our own ship. V. Stelmach. Wonder what the V stands for. Vile, vicious, vermin.
Probably all 3. You could always look it up in the computer records.
I already tried that. He's got it under a personal security code. Must be something really embarrassing.
Ignore him. We'll do what we have to, same as we've always done. I just hope our luck's better than the last time. Unseelie was bad enough, but Grendel looks as if it could manage something really unpleasant if it puts its mind to it. Shame there weren't any survivors from the first contact team. I would have liked some first-hand impressions of what we might encounter.
There was one survivor, the investigator. She failed to spot the dangers.
Might have known an investigator would survive, if anyone could. What happened to her?
They sent her to a hell world.
Where she's no bloody use at all. Typical. Still, I'm surprised they didn't execute her.
The hell world will do that.
Silence decided not to press the point. Frost was clearly touchy about her fellow investigator. They were all supposed to be perfect, dependable, infallible. It said so in their job description. Just like a captain was always supposed to know what to do for the best. Silence smiled briefly and leaned back in his command chair. Time to get the show on the road, starting with a good look from a safe distance at exactly where they'd be landing. The landing site had already been decided, and remote control mechanisms were already busy constructing secure landing pads. Silence called up the view on his private screen and frowned thoughtfully. Grendel had no solid land masses anymore, only ash. Silence had chosen this particular location because one of the few things his sensors could agree on was that there was a vault there, barely a mile below the surface, which made it the easiest by far to get at. Remote control mining equipment was currently digging its way down through the ash toward it. Except it wasn't alone down there. Surrounding the vault for miles in all directions was a city, or what was left of it. There was no trace left of the deserted cities on the surface. The scorching had left nothing but an endless sea of ash from pole to pole. But under the ash, somehow miraculously untouched by all the destruction, lay the remains of an alien civilization. The first contact team had passed through an underground city to reach their vault. The experience nearly drove them all mad. There was something about the city, something unbearable to the human mind. The sensors couldn't tell much about it, except that it was there, and completely deserted. And right in the middle of that miles-wide city lay the main vault of the Sleepers, a colossal steel tomb the size of a mountain. Only what slept within that tomb slept very lightly. Silence had already studied the first team's records of the city they encountered, but they didn't make much sense. They were far from complete, and what there was decidedly unpleasant. The details were too strange, too alien, too unlike anything Silence had ever encountered before. Even Frost admitted to finding them disturbing, and she had more experience of the alien than everyone else on the Dauntless put together. Although some of the people on board were pretty strange in themselves. Silence grimaced briefly at the thought. He ought to check in on his contact team again, now that the drop was getting so close. He raised the Marine Sergeant Angelo Null on his private screen, and nodded politely to the broad, faintly scowling face.
How are you boys doing, Sergeant? Any problems?
Nothing I can't handle. They've been thoroughly briefed as to what happened to the last contact crew, so they're not exactly happy about the drop, but at least they know what they're getting into. The triple combat pay brought a smile to their faces, and the new battle drug should help. The stuff we've been supplied with would make a mad dog killer out of a sainted nun, but I think we'll save that for emergencies. Chemical courage is all very well, but I prefer the real thing. Personally, I put more faith in the state-of-the-art weaponry they've given us. Very tasty. Recharge time is still 2 minutes minimum, but for sheer power and destructive capability, I've never seen anything like these guns. Gives me a warm, comfortable, secure feeling just looking at them.
I'm glad to hear that, Sergeant. But I feel I should remind you that the first contact team was also armed to the gills, and it didn't seem to help them much. So I want all your men armed with shrapnel clusters, concussion grenades, incendiaries, and force shields, as well as disruptors. Never mind the expense, I'll take care of all that. You load your men down with as much as they can carry and still move freely. I'm also authorizing the use of 2 portable disruptor cannon and a tangle field. Get your people prepped. We'll commence planetfall 1 hour from now.
Understood, Captain.
Sergeant Null hesitated for a moment.
Sir, we've worked with battle espers before, but Wampir? Are they really going to be part of the combat team?
That's correct, Sergeant. Do you have a problem with that? Perhaps you'd like me to issue garlic and crucifixes to the men.
No, sir. No problem, sir.
I'm glad to hear it.
Silence broke the link, and the sergeant's troubled face disappeared from the screen. Although he hadn't actually come out and said anything, Silence knew what Null meant. The Wampir weren't exactly battle troops like the Marines or even the Espers. They were more like a weapon. You pointed them at the target and then stood well back and let them get on with it. The battle espers weren't that easy to handle either. They were already borderline psychotic, or they wouldn't be able to handle working in a combat situation. You surrounded them with S-blockers till you needed them, and then let them loose and hope for the best. Pound for pound, they could be more devastating than ranked disruptor cannon, but you couldn't always trust them to stop when you wanted. They'd been officially scrapped, and the fact that the Empress had insisted on the last few for this mission said a lot about how dangerous it was likely to be. Silence had decided early on to keep them all in stasis until just before the drop. Safer all around for everyone. He just wished he could have done the same with the Wampir. He frowned thoughtfully. Officially, they were Stelmach's pets, operating solely under the direct command of the security officer. It was the Wampir's last chance to prove their usefulness. If they didn't distinguish themselves on this mission, the Wampir project would be discontinued. That should encourage them to follow orders and not make much trouble, but Silence didn't hope for much more than that. The Wampir made excellent individual warriors, fast and strong and utterly fearless, but they were no damn good at all at working with other troops. The never-ending thirst that drove them made them fierce fighters, but prone to distraction. Silence sighed. He'd been putting it off as long as he could, but he had to talk to them. He contacted their quarters and waited patiently. They had their own separate territory down below, keeping them apart from the rest of the crew, to the relief of all concerned. A dead man's face appeared on his private screen. Its flesh was pale and bloodless, and its expression was cold and distant, as though listening to some absorbing song the living could never hear. Beyond the face, the Wampir living quarters were as dark as night. They preferred it that way. Silence cleared his throat, and then wished he hadn't. It made him sound weak.
This is the captain. We'll be making planetfall within the hour. Are your people fully briefed and prepared?
Yes, Captain. We are most eager to begin.
The Wampir had their own leader under Stelmach, something to do with alpha dominance. Just another thing the humans didn't understand about the race they'd created. According to the records, this particular Wampir had been called Kyanan Bud. Once he'd been a living man, with hopes and dreams and human emotions. Then they killed him and filled his veins with synthetic blood, and whatever feelings he had now were no longer anything a human would recognize. Silence's mouth was almost painfully dry, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact.
Any problems with the blood substitute we've been providing?
It nourishes, but it's not the real thing. It doesn't satisfy.
Something in the flat, peremptory voice made Silence's skin crawl, but he kept it off of his face.
Stand ready. I'll contact you again just before the drop.
The Wampir nodded and cut off the comlink from his end. Silence sighed quietly, slowly relaxing in his chair. It could have been worse, he supposed. They could have been Hayden men.
We can't trust them. They're not human.
People have been saying that about you investigators for years. The Wampir are a useful tool in certain situations, and they'll do their duty for the same reason we will. Because nothing less than 100% commitment will get us off Grendel alive. You let me worry about the Wampir. I want you concentrating on the sleepers.
Frost shrugged.
Show me one and I'll give it my undivided attention. You keep saying we. Are you still determined to join us on this drop?
Yes. When we break open the vault, decisions are going to have to be made in a hurry, and I don't want to leave them to Stelmach.
Talking about me again.
Just saying we'd better take one last look at the records the first contact team left us. Ugly viewing, but necessary. Anything we can learn from them could end up saving lives. There's always the chance we'll spot something new, something useful.
Stelmach nodded expressionlessly, and the three of them peered silently at the images appearing on Silence's private screen as he entered the restricted codes. Most of the footage from the first team's cameras was useless. It was fine until the team actually entered the city below the surface, and then just the proximity to the alien technology began to interfere with the cameras. They cut in and out, apparently at random, so that what was left was a shifting montage of people, scenes, and events. A lot of it was blurred and uncertain, as though things had been happening too quickly for the cameras to keep up with them. Computer enhancement hadn't helped much. A lot of what was on the film was so strange, so different, that the computers had nothing in their records to compare it to. Silence couldn't bring himself to feel unhappy about that. He had a feeling seeing the whole footage intact and uninterrupted would have been enough to turn his hair gray. The record consisted of impressions and brief bursts of detail. It began with glimpses of the alien surroundings, dark and disturbing. The huge buildings had no lights, and strange shadows moved slowly across their surfaces, like drifting thoughts, as the contact team proceeded. The structures weren't just buildings. Wrapped around them like dreaming snakes, or protruding from walls and windows like so many tumors, were all kinds of alien machinery. Nightmares of twisting, shiny materials that seemed almost alive. There were machines that breathed, and coiled tubes that glistened with sweat. Stranger shapes with unblinking eyes, and things that looked like they might have been moving until you got close to them. The contact team moved among the massive buildings, like rats caught in a maze they could never hope to understand, and their voices grew high-pitched and hysterical. The party's lights glanced across shifting scenes like flashes of lightning in a storm as they shorted in and out, until finally the contact team came to the great steel doors of the Vault of the Sleepers. According to the computers, they were 23 feet tall and 10 feet wide, great featureless slabs of shining steel with no trace of lock mechanisms. The team fussed around with them for some time before losing patience and blasting them open with a portable disruptor cannon. The doors blew back, light flared within the vault, and the sleepers came boiling out. Guns flashed desperately, but the aliens were everywhere. Huge creatures 8 to 10 feet tall, wrapped in spiked silicon armor that was somehow a part of them. Mouths stuffed with steel teeth, gaping and grinning. Blood dripped and spattered from their jaws. Marines were firing in all directions, swinging swords, shouting and screaming. The aliens darting among them, almost too fast to follow, despite their size. A clawed hand tore a human head from its body, which walked on for several steps before collapsing. Another alien ripped a hole in a Marine's belly, despite his field armor, and buried its face in his guts. Blood flew on the air, intermittent light from discharging guns, screams of pain and horror. A face filled the screen, begging and pleading, and then was snatched away. An alien posed for a moment before the camera, wrapped in human entrails. A Marine stuck his gun in an alien's mouth and blew its head off. Another alien thrust its clawed hand into his back and out his chest, and waved the dying body like a banner. An alien ripped the lower jaw from a Marine's face and used it like a club till it shattered. There were aliens running on the walls and on the ceilings like huge, impossible insects. The last Marines fell, and the aliens swept past the bodies, heading for the surface. The screen showed light fading away into darkness, and then went blank. Silence sat watching the blank screen for a moment, then reached forward and turned it off. The record didn't lose any of its impact, no matter how many times he watched it. Everyone who'd recorded those scenes was dead, their footage preserved by their ship's computers. He still found it hard to believe that the aliens had slaughtered the contact team so effortlessly. But he'd seen swords shatter on the aliens' crimson armor, and disruptor beams ricochet, leaving the aliens unharmed. He was beginning to wonder if anything could stop them, short of another scorching. And these were the creatures the Empress wanted him to capture and train as shock troops.
I don't think we'll show this to the troops at their briefing. It would only upset them.
I've already shown it to them. It's my experience that informed troops last longer.
Then, with your permission, Captain, I'll set things in order for the drop. I still have arrangements to make.
Do whatever you have to. We drop on the hour. If you're not ready by then, you can walk down. Stomach nodded briefly and left the bridge.
That man needs more fiber in his diet. Are you sure we haven't got any more footage of the first contact?
This is all that's viewable. I don't think I could stand much more. I don't think I've ever seen anything as vicious and deadly as those creatures.
Damn right. I can't wait to go head-to-head with them. Been ages since I had a real challenge.
The trouble is, Silence thought dryly, I think she means it. The surface of Grendel was even more depressing in reality than it had been on the view screen. The great sea of ash stretched away in all directions, smooth and featureless and dead. There was more ash in the air, diffusing the pale crimson light of the sun, till it looked like the sky itself was bleeding. The 5 pinnaces from the Dauntless touched down one after the other on the specially constructed steel landing pads floating on the ash, and waited just long enough for the contact team to disembark before taking off again. Captain Silence looked about him, getting the feel of the new gravity. Bit heavier than he was used to, but he could manage. The rebreather built into his uniform's collar surrounded his head with a bubble of fresh air. Even if he could have breathed the vomitous mixture Grendel called air, the ash suspended in it would have blinded and choked him in seconds. He watched the departing pinnaces arrow up through the bloody skies with mixed feelings. Without them, he really was on his own. He looked back at his team, noting without surprise that it had already split up into its 3 components of Marines, Espers, and Wampir. They still all looked to him for orders, as though he had any better idea what to do than they did. Still, when in doubt, sound confident. All right, pay attention. There's an elevator to take us down to the buried city attached to the underside of these rafts, courtesy of the mining equipment. Bad news is it'll only hold 15 at a time, so the Marines will go down first to check things out. Once they've given the okay, the investigator will go down with the Espers, and then Stelmach and his Wampir. Weapons in hand, ladies and gentlemen. If it moves and it's not us, shoot it. You don't have to wait for my permission. And watch yourselves once we get down there. The alien technology can have a somewhat disquieting effect on the human mind. Just concentrate on the mission and you should be fine. Any problems?
Do you want the bad news or the really bad news?
Give it to me straight. What's gone wrong now?
First, we've lost all contact with the Dauntless. Something in the city below is interfering with our comm systems. That's a new development since the first team was here, which means if we need to leave here in an emergency, we're stuffed. We can't call for help, reinforcements, or a pickup. We're stuck here till the pinnaces return at the agreed time, which is 4 hours and counting. You might care to consider that the first team lasted a grand total of 2 hours and 7 minutes.
And the really bad news?
The mining machinery's broken down. The elevator's still working, but the shaft extends only to the edge of the underground city. That leaves us with at least an hour's walk through the city before we reach the vault.
Great, thought Silence. Just great. The one thing he'd been counting on was being able to avoid long exposure to the city's alien technology and its effects on the human mind. It also meant that they had that much less time to cope with whatever came out of the vault. Silence thought hard. Do we have any idea of why the mining machinery's broken down?
No. Telemetry's out, along with the comm systems. The slightly good news is that at least the elevator's still working, for the moment.
So that even if it gets us down to the city, there's no guarantee it'll still be working when we want to come back up.
You got it.
Marvelous. All right. We go ahead with the mission as planned. Unlike the first team, we've got battle espers and S-blockers on our side. Hopefully, one or the other will protect us from the city's influence. If not, we get to find out just how tough we really are. Get the Marines moving, investigator. Time is not on our side. The trip down in the elevator turned out to be something of an anticlimax. It was crowded, hot and stuffy, and distinctly claustrophobic, but since everyone was busy considering the horrors to come, nobody really noticed. With the comm systems out, there was no point in waiting for the Marines all clear, so Silence and the investigator accompanied the first batch of espers down, and hoped for the best. The city itself seemed quiet and peaceful, but Silence couldn't help thinking of it as the quiet of the graveyard. The Marines had already set up a perimeter with bright lights pushing back the darkness in all directions. They carried their guns at the ready and looked more than willing to use them at the first opportunity. Frost hummed something cheerful as she set off to inspect the perimeter, and Silence moved the espers off to one side. For the moment, he had all 3 of his S-blockers working, hoping their field would be strong enough to protect the entire team. But just in case, he briefed the espers on maintaining a full psionic screen should it prove necessary. They agreed easily enough, their eyes elsewhere. Silence couldn't blame them. It was all he could do to keep from turning round to stare out into the darkness. Anything could be out there. Anything at all. The Wampir waited patiently for orders. Stelmach was too busy looking around with an open mouth. Apparently, seeing the city on a view screen was quite a different thing from seeing it up close and personal. He caught Silence looking at him and closed his mouth with a snap. He barked out orders, and the Wampir moved unhurriedly to take up a formation around him. Whatever else happened, Stelmach was clearly determined on surviving to tell everyone else about it. Silence smiled crookedly. It wasn't a bad idea, surrounding yourself with a wall of Wampir. He just wished he'd thought of it first. Frost came back from the perimeter, and he put on his best cool, calm, and confident look, though he didn't know why he bothered. It had never fooled her before. She nodded casually and moved in close, her voice little more than a murmur.
Perimeter's secure for the moment. Nothing on the motion trackers, but the long-range sensors are malfunctioning. We have to consider the possibility that all our tech could fall foul to the city's influence. No guns, no force shields, no anything. We could end up going one-on-one with the sleepers, armed only with our swords and bad intentions. I'm not even going to think about the rebreathers breaking down. Of course, there's always the Wampir. They're pretty deadly in themselves, and their strength and speed aren't reliant on tech. Maybe our superiors did know what they were doing when they insisted we include the Wampir on our team. How are the Espers holding up?
Hard to tell. They're acting pretty spacey, but that's hardly unusual with battle Espers. I'm relying on the S-blockers to protect them and us for the moment. Let's get the troops moving, Investigator. The less time we spend down here, the better.
Spoil sport. You never want to do anything fun.
The Marines took the point, guns at the ready, lights blazing on their helmets. The cameras on their shoulders were still working, even though they couldn't transmit live to the Dauntless. The only way a record of this expedition would survive would be if someone returned to the surface with it. Frost moved with the Marines, eyes alight, just waiting for some enemy stupid enough to start something. Silence came next with the Espers, if only because he wanted to keep an eye on them. They ignored their surroundings and trudged along with their heads hanging. Whether this was due to the oppressive nature of the city or the numbing effects of the S-blockers was unclear. Stelmach and his Wampir brought up the rear. The city didn't seem to bother the Wampir at all, but presumably when you've already been killed and brought back, there's not much left that can upset you. Two of them were carrying a large piece of equipment that Silence hadn't been briefed on. When he'd inquired, he'd received a cold stare and was told he didn't need to know. Apparently, it was some secret weapon for Stelmach to try out if he got the opportunity. Just another secret Silence wasn't party to. He smiled briefly. Damn thing probably wasn't working anymore anyway. They moved on into the city, and things got worse. The buildings and other less obvious constructions pressed in around them, intimidatingly huge and claustrophobically close. Sometimes enigmatic projections stretched out to block the way, and then they had to be stooped under or climbed over. The surfaces felt slick and unhealthy to the touch. The moving lights hid as much in shadows as they revealed, for which Silence, for one, was grateful. What he could see was disturbing enough. The city was a nightmare of steel and flesh, an unnatural combination of breathing metals and silver-wired meat. Rounded cylinders pulsed like gleaming intestines, and pumps beat like hearts with great shifting valves. Things that might once have been living creatures had been made parts of functioning machines. There were complex devices with eyes and entrails and long metal limbs tapering away to nothing. Things moved and settled for no reason, and swiveled slowly to follow the contact team as they passed. They were great slow machines that looked as though they'd been grown as much as made, and small metal scuttling things with bright pinpoint eyes that kept to the shadows. So far, the Marines had resisted the temptation to fire at them, but their patience was getting strained. An almost palpable oppression had settled over the party like a dark cloud. Everyone could feel the pressure of watching eyes, and something listening to every sound they made. And everywhere it was all slick and smooth and functioning, as though the makers and operators had just stepped out a second ago and might return at any moment. Silence moved up to walk alongside Frost. Remind you of anything?
Yeah, the alien ship and the base it transformed on Unseelie. Biomechanics. A cross between living organic matter and functioning technology, far beyond anything we've ever achieved.
Could there be a connection between the Unseelie alien and whatever built this city?
It's possible, but the alien ship crash-landed on Unseelie very recently, and these ruins are old. According to the Dauntless's sensors, before they started acting strangely, this city has been down here longer than the human race has been civilized. Makes you think, doesn't it?
Things got worse as they descended slowly toward the vault. The weird constructions closed in around them, enigmatic and disturbing, till the team was forced to walk in single file. The crowding shapes and structures hinted at meaning and function, but never enough to make any sense. The angles and dimensions were wrong somehow, as though they added up to more than was visible with the naked eye. The Marines became twitchy and quarrelsome. Some fired their guns out into the darkness, then couldn't or wouldn't say why. Their personal force shields stopped working for no apparent reason. Silence tried turning the S-blockers off to see if the Espers could protect the team better, but they immediately became so hysterical he had to turn the S-blockers back on to keep them from going insane. Even the Wampir were affected. They stuck close together, their dead faces cold and intent. Stelmach looked like a bag of nerves, all wide eyes and trembling mouth. Silence had a growing ache between his shoulder blades from tense muscles, and it seemed to him that his thoughts weren't as clear as they had been. He sometimes lost track of what he was thinking, and had to concentrate hard to recover it. Even Frost had stopped her cheerful humming. They'd been walking just over 3/4 of an hour, and were deep in the guts of the alien city, when they lost their first man. A trapdoor opened up beneath the feet of the leading Marine, and as suddenly as that, he was gone. He just had time to start a scream, and then he disappeared into the darkness beneath the floor. Silence and Frost pushed their way forward and stood at the edges of the gap. They could hear the Marine's scream fading away to nothing, long after they lost sight of the light blinking on his helmet. The Marines clustered around the gap in the floor, shining their lights down, but the light didn't travel far, and the blackness showed them nothing at all.
Any idea how deep that is? Could we lower a line and go after him?
The sensors are out. Nothing on the motion trackers. It could be bottomless for all we know.
Move on.
Silence straightened up. A Marine glared at him.
We don't leave our people behind, Captain.
You do this time. We've no way of getting to him in the unlikely event that he is still alive. We're probably going to lose more men before we get out of here. Get used to the idea. Now move. Since you're so eager, you can take the point.
The Marine glared at him for a long moment, as though he was going to say something, and then he turned away and started off down the narrow corridor. Silence waved for the Marines to follow after him.
Everyone stay close together and keep your eyes open. No telling what other booby traps there are here.
He looked across the gap at Frost.
Are any of our instruments in good enough shape to spot things like this in advance?
Not really. The city confuses them. It's too different. Too alien.
The team moved on, jumping the gap where necessary, taking things a little more slowly now. They were all remembering what had happened to the first team. There hadn't been any booby traps then. It was as though the city was learning how to defend itself from intruders. Traps struck at them from all sides, sudden and unexpected. Pointed metal spikes shot out of a wall and skewered a passing Marine. He hung from the spikes like a butterfly on a pin, and then the spikes retreated into the wall and let his body drop to the floor. The metal made soft sucking noises as they left the Marine's body, sinister sounds in the eerie quiet. The contact team pressed cautiously on, leaving the body where it lay. They'd retrieve it on the way back, if all went well. There were sudden bursts of heat and cold, both extreme enough to sear and burn exposed flesh. Once, a howling followed them down the narrow way, shrieking in their ears, and then the sound sunk to a tone so low it shuddered in their bones. It did them no harm, so they ignored it. Compartments opened in the walls, full of mystery and strangeness, the sliding panels opening and slamming shut like snapping mouths. Gravity fluctuated from near freefall to a crushing weight that made every move an effort. One of the espers suddenly stopped in his tracks and started giggling. He laughed and laughed his sanity away until one of the Marines took pity on him and shot him in the head. The contact team pressed on. An hour had passed, and they had lost 7 Marines, 1 Esper, and 1 Wampir who hadn't looked where he was walking. Silence looked at Frost.
Are you sure this city is deserted?
The investigator shrugged.
As far as our instruments on the ship could tell, there were no life signs anywhere on the planet. Or at least nothing they recognized as life. And of course, they couldn't penetrate the vaults. Perhaps the city itself is alive.
And hungry.
Not necessarily. It's never wise to impute human motives to an alien consciousness. These incidents might be its way of trying to contact us.
Then I hate to think what it's trying to say. Though I think we can safely assume it's not at all friendly.
It could be a warning, telling us to go back, before we come to the vault, and what waits within it.
You're just full of cheerful information, aren't you?
Silence looked back at the team trailing away behind him.
Stelmach, get your Wampir up here. I want them leading the way now that we're getting closer to the vault.
Why?
Well, firstly, because they're much harder to kill, and secondly, because I'm the captain and I said so. Do it!
Their reaction speeds are superior to ours, and they can take much more punishment, but they're worth far too much to expose them to unnecessary risks.
Stelmach, they are going to the front. One more word from you and you can lead the way. Got it?
The security officer considered the question a moment, and then nodded reluctantly. The team moved slowly on, the Wampir in the lead. The Marines muttered among themselves, not sure whether to feel relieved or insulted. The city moved slowly past them, dark and glittering, and possibly aware. And finally, after 1 hour and 17 minutes, they came to the vault. It was huge, monolithic, its gleaming steel walls stretching away in all directions for as far as the lights could penetrate the darkness. The instruments went crazy over it, even those that had been functioning up until then. The Wampir and the Marines hung back, somewhat reluctant to approach the vault now they'd finally reached it. It was too big, too vast for the human mind to comfortably encompass. Silence went up to it, Frost at his side. He reached out to touch the gleaming steel, and then hesitated at the last moment. It was as though there was a cold wind blowing constantly from the wall. He could feel it as a gentle pressure on his face. His reflection in the steel looked vague, distorted, like a ghost of himself. A premonition come back to warn him. He turned away from the wall.
Set up the force shield. Once we've opened this thing up, I don't want anything getting past us and out into the city.
The Marines came forward and bustled around setting up the force field generator, glad to be doing something they understood. It wasn't much of a generator, put together from parts they'd been carrying in their backpacks, but it would produce a force screen big enough to cover any hole they could hope to make in the vault wall. The last Marine finished his task with a little flourish and pressed the activating stud. A glowing force wall appeared, sealing off the team and their part of the wall from the rest of the city. They just had time to relax a little and look at each other confidently, and then the generator shorted out, and the force field collapsed. Smoke curled up from the generator, and a few of the braver Marines batted it aside with their hands as they looked the generator over, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Frost looked at Silence.
Great start.
Can you fix it?
Silence said to the Marines.
Doesn't actually appear to be anything wrong with it. I think it's just being too close to the vault that did it. All my instruments are going crazy. The readings don't make any sense at all. But you can forget about the force shield. There's no way we can hope to fix this down here. How about the tangle field? That uses a lot less energy.
The Marines stepped suddenly back from the generator. The solid frame was melting, running away in long, shallow streams of plasteel. Silence looked at it numbly. That stuff had a melting point in the thousands. Any heat strong enough to melt the plasteel should have been more than enough to reduce the entire team surrounding it to ashes. Frost stepped forward and prodded one of the melting streams with the tip of her sword. The steel tip steamed, but seemed unharmed. The investigator pulled back the sword and sniffed the point tentatively.
Interesting.
Anything else you'd like to add?
Not right now. I'm going to have to think about this.
Frost moved away, frowning thoughtfully. You do that. He looked back at the Marines.
Set up the disruptor cannon. Make sure you've got a good field of fire for the guns. Now it's more important than ever that nothing gets past us.
The Marines set to work again, assembling the cannon from their packs. Stelmach moved in beside Silence.
Do you really think they're going to work any better than the generator?
Silence shrugged.
Damned if I know, but they'd better, or we've come all this way for nothing. According to the first team's record, it's going to take both of those cannon to make a hole in that wall.
Frost moved back to rejoin them.
We don't know why some things work and some don't. We could lose anything at any time. Our guns, our lights.
Imagine being trapped down here in the dark.
Frost shrugged.
Wouldn't bother me.
No, thought Silence. I don't suppose it would at that. But even an investigator needs to breathe.
Let's not panic ourselves, people. The first team had their difficulties, but it wasn't failing tech that killed them. The sleepers did that. At least we've got the Battle Espers and the Wampir, both of whose strengths are non-tech in origin. Speaking of which, Espers, get over here.
They drifted over to stand before him, dull-eyed and listless. Silence looked at them sternly.
I'm turning off the S-blockers. You're no use to me as you are now. Shield yourselves as best you can, but when we open up that wall, I want everything you've got trained on whatever comes out. Got it?
The Esper stared at him like children awaiting punishment. One of them looked at him with something like anger in his eyes.
You should never have brought us here, Captain. We don't belong here, any of us. It's not a human place, with human limitations. There are things out there in the darkness that we dare not look at. If you expose us to them, we'll die.
If you don't stop whining and get your act together, I'll kill you. You're battle espers, damn it. You're supposed to have been trained to handle things like this. Now brace yourselves.
He gestured to the Marines to turn off the S-blockers, and for a second nothing happened. And then the Esper who'd spoken took a deep breath and stepped back a pace. And his head exploded. Silence cried out in disgust and shock as blood and brains spattered his uniform. Another Esper began talking swiftly and urgently in a language no one recognized. The remaining Espers huddled together as though for comfort, eyes closed, concentrating all the power of their unusual minds to protect themselves. Silence felt something like guilt stirring within him, but pushed it aside. He didn't have time.
Are you stable now? Can we proceed with the mission?
The Espers nodded slowly in unison. One of them glared at Silence.
Do it. Do it while you still can. It knows we're here.
Silence turned to the Marines manning the 2 disruptor cannon. The gleaming solidity and power of the guns reassured him. There was enough power there to blast a hole through a starship's hull.
Everyone stand clear. On my order, fire both cannon. Now!
The 2 guns fired as one, the brilliant energy beams almost blinding in the gloom. Crackling energy played across the steel wall of the vault without damaging it. And then slowly, a door opened in the wall, 20 feet high and a dozen wide, swinging reluctantly back as though the sheer pressure of the guns had forced it to reveal itself. The energy beam snapped off, and everyone stared breathlessly at the darkness beyond the door, now half ajar. Silence's hand tightened round his gun till his knuckles ached, bracing himself for a flood of ravening alien life. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. It was very quiet now that the cannon had stopped firing. The only sound was the massed breathing of the expectant contact team. And then a single alien leapt out of the doorway, and blood flew on the air as it tore into the team with an insane fury. It was huge and awful, but all Silence got was an impression of glistening scarlet armor and jagged steel teeth. It moved among them, fast as thought, ripping and tearing a path through the Marines with its teeth and claws, picking Marines up and throwing them away as though they were nothing. Everyone was firing their guns, but the alien was never where they aimed. It was huge and fast and deadly, and it seemed to be everywhere at once. Disruptor beams blazed across the narrow space, cutting down 2 Marines and one of the Wampir. And then the battle Espers hit the creature with a wave of psychokinetic force, holding it in place through the sheer power of their minds. It looked like a nightmare in spiked blood-red armor, vaguely humanoid in form, its heart-shaped head lacking anything like a human face or expression. For a moment, everyone was still, and then the Wampir swarmed over the alien, trying to pull it down with their superior strength, but already the hold of the Espers was weakening. Without the S-blockers to protect them, the city was just too much to bear. The alien turned its inhuman head, and beams of crackling energy burst from its mouth and eyes, blowing people apart in sudden bloody explosions. It gestured sharply, and new spikes thrust out of its armor, transfixing the gripping Wampir. Black blood spurted from their mouths, but they didn't scream, and they wouldn't release their holds. Shrapnel exploded from the blood-red armor, blowing some of the Wampir away like bloody pincushions.
Mine burn the thing!
But the Espers couldn't hear Silence. Blood was running from their noses and ears and eyes, trickling down their straining faces like crimson tears, and their hold on the alien suddenly vanished. It shook off the remaining Wampir as though they were nothing. Frost stepped forward, took careful aim with her disruptor, and shot the creature in the head at point-blank range. The energy beam ricocheted from the scarlet armor and glanced off into the darkness, leaving the alien untouched. It took the last surviving Wampir in both hands, ripped off its head, and threw it away, and chewed at the bloody neck like a child with a treat. And then it turned and looked at Silence and Frost, standing together. and smiled a bloody smile, like a demon from some cybernetic hell. Silence glanced quickly about him. All the Wampir were dead, and Stelmach looked to be in shock. Only 2 of the Espers were still standing, and 7 of the Marines. Silence felt sick. It didn't seem possible that so many could have been killed so quickly. Frost put away her gun and pulled an incendiary grenade from her belt. Silence put a restraining hand on her arm. "Use that grenade at this range and the backblast will fry all of us. Plus there's no guarantee it would even work. That ugly-looking bastard shrugged off energy beams easily enough." Frost smiled briefly.
I was going to make him eat it.
Not a bad idea, but we still got one last card to play. Stelmach! Time for that secret weapon of yours!
The security officer stared at him blankly, his eyes wide with shock. Silence cursed briefly. He started toward Stelmach, and the alien threw aside the Wampir body it was holding, and started toward him with slow, almost casual steps. It knew he had nowhere to go. Silence fired his disruptor, aiming for the glowing eyes. The energy beam glanced harmlessly away. Frost hefted her grenade and lunged forward. The alien slapped her away with a backhand sweep of its overlong arm. She crashed into the steel wall of the vault and slumped dazed to the floor, the grenade falling unactivated from her hand. Silence gripped his sword fiercely. The alien's smile seemed very wide and very bloody. And then Stelmach activated his secret weapon. And everything slowed right down. A glowing golden field formed around the alien, and it froze in its tracks, mouth still stretched in a crimson grin. A draining cold surged through Silence's bones, and it took all his strength to move away. His thoughts grew slow and sluggish, and then he had Frost by the arm and was dragging her clear off the field. After a moment, she was able to help him, and the 2 of them stumbled back to join Stelmach by his quietly humming machine. Life quickly came back to them, and Silence nodded to the security officer.
"I'm glad I brought you along after all. What the hell is that device?"
Stasis projector. Puts anything into stasis from practically any distance. Eats up power like crazy, but this was pretty much point blank.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought the whole point of a stasis field was that you couldn't project it. You set it up where you need it and then turn it on or off.
Not anymore.
And how come that projector's working when nothing else is?
This little beauty is based on different technology. The same technology that produced the new star drive. Need I say more? No, I didn't think so. Apparently this technology is somewhat sturdier than our own. Perhaps even compatible. Even so, I recommend we get the alien upstairs and under wraps as quickly as possible, just in case.
Hold on just a minute. Why didn't you use the damn thing the moment the alien appeared, instead of waiting till most of us were dead?
Right.
Basically, the techs who provided me with this device weren't actually 100% sure it would work. In fact, they seemed to think there was a small but significant chance that the whole thing could detonate rather dramatically once it was turned on, which is why I put off using it until I absolutely had to.
No wonder they wouldn't tell me what it was. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have let it on board my ship. Ah, hell. The alien's all yours. Get it out of my sight.
Stelmach manipulated the controls of his projector, and the alien floated slowly forward, hovering barely an inch above the floor, buoyed up by the stasis field. The security officer moved cautiously forward, steering the alien ahead of him, and the 2 of them disappeared into the darkness that led back to the surface. Silence gestured for 4 Marines to go after Stelmach and his prize, and then looked around to see how many of his people had survived the alien's attack. He was saddened, but not surprised to find he had only 2 more Marines and 1 Esper left in his team. Everyone else was dead, their bloody remains scattered before the opening in the vault wall. He shook his head slowly. So many dead just to capture one of the creatures. The thought took hold of him suddenly, and he took a step toward the door in the wall. This time, Frost grabbed him by the arm.
Way ahead of you, Captain. Now that the vault's opened, where are all the other sleepers? Even so, I don't think just casually walking into the vault to take a look is a good idea.
All right. What do you suggest?
We've got 1 Esper left. Let him work for his pay.
Silence and Frost looked at the single surviving Esper, and he looked back at them with a bitter resignation. He was tall and slender, with a tired, washed-out look, colorless blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and a surprisingly firm mouth. Silence reminded himself that this man had survived when his fellow Espers hadn't.
You don't have to do this. You've done more than enough already, and I'll see you're mentioned in my report. But we have to know what's going on in that vault, and you're all we've got.
I know. In the end, it always comes down to me and my kind, doesn't it?
He moved toward the vault wall without waiting for an answer, and stopped just inside the doorway. His back straightened with a snap, and a shocked gasp escaped his lips. Silence stared after him, and the Esper waved him back without looking around.
I'm all right. I just wasn't prepared for this when I opened my mind. All I can see is space, stretching away in all directions. No life or trace of life. We got here too late. Whatever happened here, it's over.
Any idea of what happened?
It's too big. I feel like a fly crawling across the stained glass window of a cathedral and trying to comprehend its function.
Whatever happened here, it must have left impressions. Go deeper. We have to know. What happened to the other sleepers?
The Esper groaned loudly, cords of muscle standing out in his neck.
The violence! Death and slaughter and more! The walls are full of it.
There were thousands of aliens here. Too many to count. Packed together like insects in a hive. Sleeping. Waiting. Then something broke in and woke them up.
Ghost warriors!
Silence and Frost looked at each other. Ghost warriors were human corpses used as weapons, guided by computer implants, controlled by the rogue AIs of Shub.
The vault was swarming with them, fighting the aliens, armed with strange weapons I don't recognize.
And in the end, they pulled the sleepers down by sheer force of numbers and dragged them away. They took the damaged ghost warriors, too, for repairing and recycling later. The warriors were defected by the city because they weren't really here. Their controllers were safe back on Shub. Maybe it wouldn't have affected them anyway. The AIs don't think like we do.
For a long moment, the Esper didn't say anything. Silence cleared his throat.
Why did they leave one alien behind?
As a surprise for whoever came after them. The AIs wanted you to know what happened here. They're going to make ghost warriors out of the sleepers and turn them loose on the Empire. Give me your disruptor, Captain.
Silence frowned.
Is there something still in there?
Just give me your gun, Captain.
Silence stepped forward, and the Esper turned unhurriedly to take the disruptor. Silence caught a glimpse of the vault's interior and looked away as he stepped back. The Esper was right. It was too big. The Esper hefted the gun in his hand, as though surprised by the weight. Perhaps he was. Espers weren't usually allowed weapons. He looked at Silence calmly.
I've seen what Shub has planned for us. It's horrible. I have no wish to see it happen. Goodbye, Captain. It's been interesting. I damn you and the Empire to hell, but hell is coming for you anyway.
And he put the gun to his head and shot himself. Silence cursed as the headless body slumped to the floor and knelt down to pry his disruptor from the Esper's hand.
Damn. That is not going to look good on my report. I should have known better than to give him a gun.
Frost shrugged.
Espers. Fragile, all of them.
Silence straightened up and holstered his gun.
Sleeper ghost warriors. They'd be unstoppable in the field. But why come here now? Are they planning a new offensive? And if so, when and where? We better get back to the ship. The Empire has to know about this.
Something else to think about. The captain of the Defiant was quite definite that nothing had got past him, let alone landed on Grendel, broke open the vaults, and carried away the sleepers. The only answer that makes sense is that the AIs on Shub have developed some really effective new cloaking technology, powerful enough to blind all our sensors, which is really bad news for all of us. It means the Ghost Warriors could strike anywhere, anytime, and the first we'd know of it would be when their attack ships started blasting our cities. We wouldn't even be able to fight back. What use would our energy weapons be without sensors to aim them?
If you've quite finished lowering our morale, I've got something else that'll spoil your day. We're going to have to check out all the other vaults on Grendel, one by one, to see if they've been opened and emptied by the Ghost Warriors. And you saw what opening up just this one did to us.
Join the fleet and see the universe. We have to be sure, Captain. There's always Stelmach's machine.
For as long as it holds up under these conditions. We can't trust anything down here. Anything at all. Back on the bridge of the Dauntless, Silence sat slumped in his command chair and tried hard not to fall asleep through sheer weariness. He'd taken a little something to keep him awake and alert, but it was taking a long time kicking in. Frost stood beside his chair, cool and collected as always. She looked as fresh and fit as if she'd just arrived on duty, but then she always did. That was an investigator's training for you. The rest of his team were a mess. The few surviving Marines were sleeping off sedation down in the med bay, recovering from shock and battle fatigue and exposure to the alien city. Silence felt very much that he would have liked to join them, but there was still work to be done. He had 120 Marines still on board, but he wasn't about to risk them down in the Undercity until he had some idea of how to protect them. The Battle Espers and the Wampir were all dead. It bothered him that he didn't care as much about their deaths as he did for the Marines. He shook his head. He had more important things to think about. Like how Stelmach was getting on with examining the captured sleeper down in the science lab. Silence raised the security officer on his personal screen. The man looked tired and preoccupied. Anything you feel like sharing with us yet, Stelmach?
Not much. The sleeper is so different from what we normally consider as life that half my instruments won't work on it. What information I am getting is enough to turn your hair white. One thing is becoming clearer all the time. This is a genetically engineered creature. A living killing machine. The perfect warrior class. Almost literally unbeatable on the physical level. We only beat it by cheating.
The Ghost Warriors beat them.
Yes, but according to the Esper, they had weapons and numbers far superior to ours. Shub's always been 20 years ahead of us, if not more. I'll get back to you later, when I've got something more significant to say. Stelmach out.
His face had only just disappeared from Silence's private screen when the image suddenly cleared, and Silence found himself looking at the stern face of the Imperial Communications Officer on Golgotha. Silence sat up straight in his chair and tried to look alert.
Captain Silence, you have new orders. These supersede all previous orders. You are to leave Officer Stelmach and his captive with the Defiant and proceed immediately to the planet Chandrakor. The traitor Owen Deathstalker is traveling there with other enemies of the Empire, including the notorious Jack Random. A spy in their company has provided us with the exact coordinates for Chandrakor. You are to capture these people alive. They have knowledge of the exact location for the Dark Void device. You are hereby authorized to take any and all actions necessary to retrieve the device and return it to the Empire. After you have the device, you may execute the outlaws. This information is classified, your eyes only. Message ends.
His face vanished from the screen. Silence looked at Frost.
Officially, you didn't hear that.
Of course not, Captain. Pity we're leaving, Grendel, just as it was getting interesting. Still, the Deathstalker, Random, and the device. Now that's what I call a mission.
The Dark Void device. I can't believe that nightmare's turned up again after all these years.
We'd better hope it has. It's about the only thing I can think of that could take on the AIs on Shub, if they really are turning the sleepers into ghost warriors. Still, Jack Random and the Deathstalker. I'll enjoy killing them.
I thought you'd like that bit. Just remember we have to get our hands on the device first. Dead men don't share secrets. So, Chandracore, here we come. I always thought that planet was a myth, a legend, like the Wolfling world. Just goes to show.
What?
Pardon?
It just goes to show what?
I don't know. Something.
Very erudite. Well, here's one more thing for you to think about. Stelmach seemed pretty sure that the sleepers were genetically engineered, which suggests rather strongly that they must have been created with a particular purpose in mind. Or, at the very least, a particular enemy. What do you suppose could be so dangerous, so deadly, that the sleepers had to be created to fight it? And is it still out there somewhere, just waiting for us to stumble over it?
Silence looked at her for a moment. I don't know why I keep you around, Investigator. You can be really depressing when you put your mind to it. Frost nodded calmly.
It's a gift.
A wedding. It was hot under the lights of the arena, but then it always was. The masked gladiator bowed courteously to the crowd's roar, and missed a step as his head went suddenly light. Enough playing to the crowd. Time to get the hell out of the arena while he still could. It wouldn't do his image any good at all if he had to be carried out on a stretcher. He couldn't feel the blood he was losing, but he could see it coursing down his legs. He stomped off toward the nearest gate, rocking dizzily with every step. The crowd cheered as he went, a tall, muscular man with no crest or insignia on his armor, and an anonymous steel helm hiding his face. A mystery wrapped in an enigma, as always. The masked gladiator strode through the gate. Then the door to his private chambers was right there before him, though he didn't remember getting there. He'd be safe on the other side of that door. His privacy was ensured by the arena management, and his own oft-repeated statement that he'd kill anyone who tried to spy on him or otherwise bother him. He hit the security plate with the palm of his hand, and the door opened as the computer recognized his palm print. He staggered through the door, and it shut itself behind him. His mentor and trainer, George McCracken, hurried toward him, worry plain in his face. The gladiator smiled.
"Hi, honey. I'm home."
And then the strength went out of his legs, and George caught him just before he hit the ground. Things got rather confused after that, and the next clear thought came as George was helping him out of the regeneration machine. He was still wearing his armor, but the pain in his side and back was gone, along with the injuries. There wouldn't even be any scars. He grunted his approval. Excellent device. He stood there quietly a moment, winding down, emerging slowly from the persona of the masked gladiator, and letting his other self come to the surface again. And then he took off his helm to reveal the calm face of that most notorious fop, Finley Campbell. If his father could have seen him, he'd have had a stroke. The thought never ceased to amuse Finley. He'd been playing his double role long enough that he took much of it for granted, but that particular wrinkle never failed to raise a smile. He stripped off the last of his armor and let George take it away, and then stood nude before the mirror and stretched slowly, as unself-conscious as a cat. Sweat was drying on his chest and arms, and he absently accepted a towel from George and mopped at his body while his mind was elsewhere. George McCracken had been with him for years, as was his right. He'd been the original masked gladiator before he finally tired of it and bequeathed the helm and the legend to his pupil and successor. No one ever knew. He mopped at Finley's back with another towel, a dark and brooding figure muttering quietly about the stupidity of taking needless risks.
"Oh, I always feel good after a kill. It cleans out the system, purging all the dark thoughts and impulses."
Just as well. If you couldn't quench your thirst for blood in the arena, no one would be safe. Probably wipe out half the aristocracy in duels.
I knew you were a natural-born killer the first time I saw you fight.
Finley looked at him.
Are you telling me you didn't enjoy your time on the sands as the masked gladiator?
No, but I fought for the challenge. You do it for the thrill. There's a difference. Which is why you'll find it a lot harder to step down than I did. But eventually, even your appetite will grow cold, and then it'll be your turn to pass on the helm and the legend to another fool with blood in his eyes and a devil in his heart.
Maybe. It's all my father's fault, you know. I knew I was born to be a warrior, even as a child. I'd fight anyone at the drop of an insult, no matter how much bigger they were. I won a surprising number of fights, too. I'd have been happy in any branch of the service, fighting the Empress's enemies. But no, I was the eldest and the heir, and that meant I couldn't be allowed to do anything that might risk my precious skin. I still received excellent training in the use of the sword and the gun. That was part of my heritage and couldn't be denied me. But it was never enough. Not nearly enough. I needed something more to fire my blood, stir my senses, make me feel alive. I fought my first duel when I was 15. Cut the poor bastard to ribbons. It felt so good, so right. After that, a bodyguard went everywhere with me and fought my duels on my behalf. You can guess how popular that made me with my peers. I'd never been exactly admired before, but after that I was a pariah. I've a lot to thank my father for. It was a long time before I thought of the arena. I slipped my bodyguard's leash, bribed my way past the arena staff, and fought my first match under a hologram mask. Nothing fancy, no frills, just sword to sword. And when it was over, and I was alive, and he was dead, it was like coming home. I developed my fop persona to keep anyone from finding out about my little secret. After all, if it became public, it would be a major scandal, an heir to one of the greatest houses, fighting all comers in the arena. Dear father would have had an aneurysm on the spot.
You never told me any of this before. I knew most of it, of course. Made it my business to know. But you never wanted to talk about it, so I never pressed the point. What brought this on all of a sudden?
Finley shrugged.
I don't know. Maybe I'd just got a taste of my own mortality out there today.
About time. Just because you've always won, it doesn't mean you can't lose. You've been getting cocky lately. If there's one thing the arena teaches us all, it's that it doesn't matter how good you are. There's always someone better.
Like who?
Finley threw aside his towel and reached for his other persona's clothes.
Well, Kid Death for one. He's the newcomer I know. You keep well clear of him. He's crazy.
And that makes him unbeatable?
In practice, yes, because he wouldn't care about dying himself if it meant he could take you with him. For once in your life, listen to what I'm telling you. I didn't train you to be the best in the arena just to lose you to a genius madman with a sublimated death wish.
Point taken.
Finley sat down on a nearby bench to pull on his knee-length leather boots.
I have been getting a little obsessed with the fighting just lately. The arena feels so clean and uncomplicated after the endless intrigues and politicking in high society. Every word has a dozen meanings, every statement a dozen levels. And you can't turn around without tripping over a conspirator murmuring in a traitor's ear. Luckily, my family, and everyone else's, considers me a coward as well as a fop. So mostly I get left on the sidelines as not worth bothering with. There'd be no glory in defeating the likes of me in a duel, and I haven't the wit to be trusted in a conspiracy. I always knew that persona would come in handy. It keeps me out of intrigues, protects my secret, and affords me endless amusement. Life is good, George. Though death is more fun.
Hang on to that good mood. You're going to need it. In case you've forgotten, and you probably have, he asked me to remind you that you have a wedding to attend this afternoon. It sounds pretty important, only for direct members of the families involved. A distinctly minor noble such as myself wouldn't even get past the door.
Finley put the finishing touches to his outfit and regarded himself thoughtfully in the full-length mirror.
Now, don't get touchy. You wouldn't like it anyway. No excitement, no bloodshed, just determinedly polite voices, fattening finger food, and inferior champagnes. It is a rather important occasion, I suppose, if you're interested in such things. A cousin of mine, Robert Campbell, is to marry one Letitia Schreck, and thus bring the two families together. An arranged marriage, of course, for cold and practical political reasons. The two clans have been at each other's throats for as long as anyone living can remember, but right now we find ourselves in need of mutual support against common enemies. So all the bloody hatchets are to be buried in a wedding. It'll all end in tears, of course, but no one gives a damn about that. Doesn't matter if they never see each other again, really, as long as they donate sperm and egg to the body banks and remain officially married. Poor Robert and Letitia. Never even met each other, as far as I know.
George smiled.
You're going to find it terribly quiet and dull after today's excitement in the arena.
Not necessarily. There are times when family gatherings can be more dangerous and loaded with traps than anything you'd find in the arena.
And then they both looked round sharply as the door swung open behind them, which should have been impossible. The security system on the door was supposed to be state-of-the-art. Finley snatched up his sword Morgana, still bloody, and George produced an energy gun from somewhere. A nun walked through the door, all billowing black robes and folded hands, with a hood pulled down low to hide her face. Finley didn't relax, and George didn't lower his gun. The Sisters of Mercy were common enough in the corridors under the arena, but even so, there was no way she should have been able to get past the door. She stopped a respectful distance away. The door swung shut behind her, and for a tense moment, everyone held their position. And then the nun raised her slender aristocratic hands and pushed back her hood. And George and Finley relaxed with almost explosive releases of breath. Finley put down his sword, and George made his gun disappear again.
Evangeline!
Finley hurried toward her.
You promised you wouldn't come here again. It's too dangerous.
I know, but I couldn't stay away. I had to be with you.
And then Evangeline Schreck was suddenly in his arms, and they were kissing with a passion that heated the small changing room like an oven. George looked briefly heavenward, shook his head, and moved off into the adjoining room to give them a little privacy. Left to themselves, the two lovers clung together like children lost in a storm. Finley's heart ached in his chest, and he couldn't seem to get his breath. It was always the same when he held her in his arms. He could never really believe that someone as special as she would care for him as much as he cared for her. The arena warmed his blood, but Evangeline burned in his heart like a pure white-hot flame. Her familiar scent filled his head like a drug, but she was real and solid in his arms. She was his love, his one and only love, and he would have killed for her, died for her, or anything else she might require. And it might come to that someday, for their secret love was forbidden. He was heir to the Campbells, and she was heir to the Schrecks, two families at war for generations. The current arranged marriage that afternoon between two minor cousins of no importance to anyone had already almost spilled over into bloodshed a dozen times. And for the two heirs to marry, unthinkable. One house would inevitably be engulfed by the other, though not without mass slaughter on both sides. He was Campbell, and she was Schreck, and they must be mortal enemies to their death, and beyond. Except they had met by accident, both wearing masks, not knowing who the other was till it was far too late, and they had both fallen in love. It happened so quickly, but it changed their lives forever. Now they lived for what few brief meetings they could snatch in private, knowing always that were they to be discovered, it would mean shame and probably death for both of them. Some scandals simply could not be allowed. Finley held her in his arms and buried his face in her hair.
You took too big a risk coming here. You could have been followed.
I wasn't.
She wouldn't look up at him.
I used an esper to be sure. And who'd recognize me in this outfit? There were always Sisters of Mercy here, caring for the injured and the dying. No one ever remembers the face of a nun. I had to come, Finley. I heard about the creature they set on you. I had to be sure you were safe.
I keep telling you, you've got nothing to worry about. I'm the best, love. It wasn't even close today.
You keep saying that, but anyone can have a bad day, make a wrong move. I wish.
I know.
But I can't give it up. As much as I need you, I need this, too. It's part of what makes me, me. I couldn't walk away from this and still be the man you love. Evangeline.
I know. It's just that I worry so much. I never thought there'd be anyone like you in my life, someone who mattered so much to me. I hate everything that comes between us.
Don't.
He pushed her gently away from him, so that he could look into her face.
You're always with me, my love. You're always in my thoughts. I even took your middle name to christen my sword.
Thanks a whole lot. Other lovers get gifts or flowers or jewelry. I get a sword named after me.
It's a good sword.
And that makes all the difference.
A cloud fell across her face, and she pushed herself away from him.
How's your wife, Finley?
He blinked uncertainly.
Fine, as far as I know. We don't see any more of each other than we have to these days. She has her life and I have mine, and as long as we don't actually have to meet each other, we get along great. What brought this on, love? You know I never loved her or her me. It was an arranged marriage to consolidate a business deal. I'd divorce her in a minute if I thought there was any way you and I could be together. Why are you asking me about her now?
Because you and I are going to be at the wedding this afternoon. Our presence is required. But what about her? What about Adrienne? Will she be there too?
Yes, she will. But knowing dear Adrienne, she'll get stuck into the booze the minute she gets there, and will quite probably be entirely potted before we even get to the ceremony. Don't worry, my love. We'll have our chance to be together, as long as we're careful. Very careful. They must never know about us, Evangeline. I know you hope things will change between the clans, but they won't. They'd fight a war over us if they knew.
Worse than that. We'd never see each other again.
He took her in his arms and stopped her words with his mouth. And then, for a long moment, they just stood there together, holding each other tightly. So tightly no one would ever be able to tear them apart. The most mismatched and politically sensitive wedding of the season was held in a ballroom belonging to Clan Wolf. Given the complicated web of deceit, intrigue, and vendetta that connected the Campbells and the Shreks, it was as near as they could get to neutral ground. Both families had long-standing arguments with the Wolves, but they weren't actually openly fighting at the moment. They weren't allies, and probably never would be, but it was a case of better the minor enemy you know than the friend who might turn on you. So the Wolves hosted, for an extortionate price, and the Campbells and the Shreks promised to be on their best behavior. The Wolves posted extra guards just in case. The ballroom itself was large and ostentatious, decorated on walls and floor and ceiling to the point of overkill. The ceiling was a hollow of the night sky, with stars scattered thickly, like diamonds on black velvet. Few of the guests noticed. They were more interested in watching each other. Finley Campbell was there with his wife, as required. Neither of them were particularly happy about it. They'd had a blazing row on their wedding day, and things had gone rapidly downhill ever since. They'd only agreed to the arranged marriage under the greatest of pressures, and a few not terribly discreet threats. They would have had each other assassinated long ago if they could only figure out how to get away with it, but the Imperial Espers had taken all the fun out of interfamily murder, so the marriage continued under protest. In the meantime, they kept as far apart as possible, and met only on formal occasions that demanded their presence, like this one. The only things they had in common were their 2 children, 5 and 6 years old respectively, already holy terrors by all accounts. The product of laboratory conceptions and births, they spent their early years under family-approved nannies and were currently attending family-approved boarding schools. Strong clan loyalty was made, not born, and the family believed in starting early. They also didn't want to risk any interference from the parents. Finley often thought wistfully of his son and daughter. He enjoyed their company when he could, and had a feeling he might have made a good father for them, given the chance. But as in so many other things these days, it was not allowed. Finley sighed quietly and looked around him, hoping for diversion, if not inspiration. He himself was the height of fashion, as always, from his shocking pink cutaway coat to his fluorescent face and shoulder-length metallicized hair of burning bronze. His cravat was midnight blue silk, fashionably badly tied to show one did it oneself. His velvet cap was jet black with a single peacock's feather, and he regarded the scene through a pair of jeweled pince-nez spectacles he didn't need, but which added just the right touch. He also carried a sword on his hip, as custom required, but though the hilt and scabbard were crusted with precious stones, only Finley knew the blade in the scabbard was perfectly serviceable, and not in the least ornamental. The wedding was due to take place in half an hour, and the ballroom was crowded. One voice still rose above the general din, and without looking round, Finley knew it had to be his wife, Adrienne. She had one of those laser beam voices that can cut through anything. Not for the first time, Finley thought if the family could just find some way of harnessing it as a weapon, they'd make a fortune. He turned slowly, resignedly, and sure enough, there was Adrienne holding court before a group of minor nobles' wives, who looked like they'd rather be somewhere else. Anywhere else. Adrienne was of average height and just a little more than average weight, but made her presence known by being the loudest, both visually and audibly, person in any gathering. She wore a long black gown, partly because she thought the color suited her pale skin, but mostly because that way she could claim to be in mourning for her marriage. It was as far off the shoulder as she could get it without actually having it fall around her knees, and it was split up the sides as far as her hips. It looked like it would take one good sneeze for it to fall off. She had a sharp face, all planes and angles, and angry scarlet mouth. Her eyes were narrow and perhaps just a little too close together, and she had the smallest, most upturned nose that money could buy. She had a mop of curly hair, shining bright gold like a distress beacon. Her movements were sudden and abrupt, like a striking bird, and she treated each conversation as an enemy to be dominated and brought to heel. It was possible she might have heard of tact somewhere, but if she had, she'd never been seen to bother with it. If she'd been a man, her mouth would have bought her 100 duels. As it was, there were those who suggested broadening the term man to include Adrienne Campbell on general principles. She had a large drink in her hand, from which she took large gulps in between hectoring her audience, and God help the servants if they weren't there to refill her glass when she needed it. She looked about the magnificent ballroom and shook her head disgustedly.
God, this place is a dump! I've seen livelier funerals and better catered. I'd pour this wine down the toilet, but I'd swear someone already beat me to it. And would you look at the groom? I've seen men being prematurely buried who look happier than he does. And the bride, she's a child. Probably have to give her wedding night a miss so she can finish her homework. I take it someone has taken her to one side and filled her in on the facts of life. Like 1, always use a contraceptive, and 2, always get it in writing and preferably witnessed. Look at her. Poor thing looks as confused as a blind lesbian in a fish market. Still, a good lay should put some color in her cheeks. Not that she'll necessarily get one from that long drink of tap water she's marrying.
Adrienne went on like that for some time, pausing only when she absolutely had to breathe or drink or glare at someone who didn't look like they were listening to her intently enough. Finley watched admiringly, from a distance. He appreciated a good performance, and Adrienne was certainly on form this afternoon. Mind you, after enduring several years of such verbal battery at close range, he'd acquired a certain immunity. Others were not so fortunate. More than one of the ladies in Adrienne's current audience looked as though they were thinking wistfully how easy it would be to drop something really unpleasant but not necessarily actually fatal in Adrienne's drink when she wasn't looking. Finley completely understood the impulse. Adrienne's voice had the carrying quality of an airstrike and was usually about as welcome. People arranging parties and other social gatherings had been known to get extremely inventive when it came to producing reasons why Adrienne shouldn't attend, everything from outbreaks of plague to social unrest, but it didn't make any difference. Adrienne turned up anyway. As a Campbell by marriage, she couldn't be excluded, and she had very thick skin. And it had to be said, the more attention they paid to her, the less they paid to Finley Campbell, which wasn't always a bad thing. He gazed about the crowded ballroom, packed with all the bright flowers of the aristocracy going through the familiar ritual dances of intrigue and seduction, politics and gossip. Finley despised them all. They knew nothing of courage, or the true extremes of life and death, except in their carefully orchestrated code duello, where honor was often satisfied with first blood. Finley watched them all with an empty smile on his face, and contempt in his heart. He looked desperately about him in search of diversion, and his gaze lighted on the wolves. The wolf himself was absent, along with his new wife, a courtesy so that whatever happened they could officially ignore any behavior that might threaten the neutrality of the occasion. But Valentine, Stephanie, and Daniel were there, looking as though they'd much rather be somewhere else. Finley smiled slightly. Of course, all three of them had arranged marriages of their own, coming up in the very near future. Presumably their father had insisted they attend to gain a few pointers on the terrible fate that awaited them. Stephanie and Daniel were standing together, ostentatiously ignoring their respective betrothed, who were currently chatting amiably with each other and getting on like a house on fire. Valentine stood alone, as always, tall and slender and darkly delicate, wearing a plum-colored coat and leggings. With his long, dark curly hair and painted face, he looked like nothing so much as a rich but bruised fruit from some unhealthy tree. Beyond the mascaraed eyes and wide crimson smile, his face seemed polite but partly absent, as though his thoughts were somewhere else. Finley didn't like to think where that might be. Valentine had no wine glass in his hand, presumably because there wasn't a wine in the room potent enough to jolt his jaded appetites. Finley decided he'd better find someone to talk to before someone really boring settled on him, and the wolves looked as interesting as any. Besides, Valentine intrigued him. They'd both attended the same school at the same time, but that was pretty much all they had in common, then and now. As far as Finley could remember, Valentine had been a normal enough child, with no hint of warning of what he was to become. But then that was probably true of him, too. He strode casually over to the wolves, as though he just happened to be drifting in their direction, nodding and smiling to those he passed, every movement the epitome of grace. He stopped before Valentine and bowed with a flourish. The wolf heir nodded courteously in return, the heavy black eye makeup and scarlet mouth standing out starkly against his pale skin. That particular look hadn't been fashionable in years, but having found something that appealed to his inner nature, Valentine was apparently loath to change it. Finley wondered, with a sudden flash of insight, whether the painted face might be as much a mask as the one he wore, and if so, what other, stranger Valentine might lie behind it. A disturbing thought. Whatever lay behind the mask, it would have to be pretty damned strange to outdo his everyday persona. Finley smiled dazzlingly.
You're looking very yourself, Valentine. I must say, I'm always surprised to see you actually up and about these days. Of course, if you were taking half the things you're supposed to be taking, I'd expect you to be wheeled in on a stretcher with a drip in your arm and tubes up your nose.
I try to maintain a careful balance between my inner and outer worlds. I see my condition as a continuing work of art, with drugs the colors of my palette, and every work of art must be seen by an audience to be truly appreciated. Not that most people understand or appreciate the effort and hard work involved in an ongoing performance.
I do understand. No one appreciates the sheer effort involved in being at the cutting edge of fashion. But you seem to be thriving on the pressure, Valentine. Perhaps you could give me the name of your chemist.
Valentine studied him silently for a moment, his face entirely expressionless, and Finley wondered what he'd said. Something had thrown the wolf heir off balance. Finley decided to change the subject, whatever it was, rather than have it pursue some end he wasn't sure he wanted to reach.
I understand your wedding is scheduled to take place soon, Valentine. Any help I can offer, having been through the ghastly business myself?
Why, thank you, Finley, but I think I have everything under control. The flowers have been ordered, the bridesmaids chosen, and I've designed a rather special fruit punch for the occasion that should open a few eyes. I myself shall be wearing white with a veil, and perhaps just a dash of belladonna for scent. I've taken care to inform my intended of this, so that our outfits won't clash.
I'm sure she was very appreciative of that.
The last I'd heard, she was offering quite a handsome reward for anyone willing to assassinate me. And if that doesn't work out, I understand she has professed a complete willingness and determination to do the job herself, with whatever weapons happen to be at hand on the wedding day.
She is currently trying to stir up a vendetta between her family and mine, but since her parents helped arrange the match in the first place, due to the rather large dowry that comes with me, she's not getting very far.
Oh, she sounds very resolute.
Oh, yes, I do so admire a woman with spirit.
You must introduce me to her, Valentine, someday.
No sooner said than done. Here comes the lady now. Doesn't she look splendid? Finley looked round sharply. A tall, gangling woman in her late 20s was advancing on them, wearing a bright scarlet gown with gold and silver trimmings to show off her perfect pale skin and naturally red hair. Finley had to wonder if perhaps the fashion for fluorescent skin and metallicized hair was over. Things change so fast nowadays. The young lady slowed to a halt before him and Valentine, quivering with suppressed emotion, her eyebrows sunk in a truly ferocious scowl. Her mouth was an angry straight line that spoke of barely controlled rage. Finley found his hand had dropped automatically to the sword on his hip. His instincts knew a genuine threat when they saw one. He bowed politely, and she shot him a look of undisguised venom. Finley felt a sudden urge to check how far he was from the nearest exit. She had the look of someone who threw things. Heavy things. Valentine seemed entirely unperturbed, and smiled courteously. "Finley Campbell, may I present Beatrice Christiana, soon to be my bride."
Eat shit and die, clown, and you can put that hand away because I have absolutely no intention of shaking it. I'd rather French kiss a leper than touch any part of you. With all the drugs boiling through what's left of your system, even your sweat's probably addictive. I received your latest communication. I think the veil is an excellent idea. May I also suggest a muzzle and a chastity belt, because you're not getting anywhere near me. I personally will be wearing a decontamination suit and carrying an electric cattle prod instead of a bouquet.
I really must introduce you to my wife.
Isn't she wonderful? I do like a woman with spunk. We were made for each other, Beatrice. Just think what our children will be like.
You have a better chance of winning the church's annual Sobriety and Good Citizenship Award than you have of fathering a child on me, Valentine. I do not believe in laboratory fertilizations, and if you ever bring your disgusting parts anywhere near me, I will cram them into a blender. This is a political marriage only, Valentine. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go and find something really fragile and expensive that I can throw at a wall.
She shot a brief glance at Finley.
Do you have any idea what you look like? And I'd wipe that expression off your face, Finley Campbell, if I were you, or the wind might change and you'll be stuck that way.
And she stomped off, disappearing back into the crowd, which kept trying to get out of her way, but just weren't fast enough on their feet. Finley realized he was holding his breath, and let it out in a long sigh. He looked at Valentine, entirely lost for words, but the wolf heir seemed unperturbed. He flicked an invisible fleck of dust from his cuff, and smiled at Finley. "She'll come to appreciate my little ways. Eventually." Not too far away, Evangeline Schreck, tall, slender, and positively waif-like in an off-the-shoulder gown, watched her beloved Finley talking with the notorious Valentine Wolf, and felt an almost overpowering urge to rush over and rescue him, or at least protect him. Valentine looked to her like nothing more than a corpse in a carnival mask, a harlequin in heat, all that was sick and corrupt in current society. But she couldn't even go near Finley without good cause. Even allowing for the imminent marriage that was to link the Campbells with the Schrecks, there was still much bad feeling between the two houses. It was a miracle no one had thrown down a formal challenge yet. It would look odd at best, and suspicious at worst, if she were to just walk up to Finley and start chatting with him. Officially, they'd only ever met in passing on occasions like this. People would raise their eyebrows and make comments. They might even ask questions. Evangeline forced herself to look away, and there was her father standing beside her. She composed herself quickly and hoped her small involuntary start would be taken for surprise rather than guilt. Lord Gregor Schreck smiled at her fondly and patted her on the arm with his chubby hand. The Schreck was a short, round butterball of a man, all bulging flesh and deep-set eyes, with a constant, quietly unnerving smile. It amused him to indulge himself, and he cared nothing for fashion, which in turn cared nothing for him. He was not a sociable man, and as a rule avoided all gatherings he wasn't absolutely obliged to attend. He had never been popular or courted, despite his high station and prestigious connections, and he didn't give a damn. He had other, private concerns.
"Can I get you a drink, my dear? Something to eat, perhaps? You know how it worries me when you don't eat."
"I'm sure, Father. Thank you. I don't want anything."
The Shrek shook his head unhappily.
"You must keep your strength up, my dear, or you'll waste away to skin and bone. You want to look nice for your papa, don't you?"
The hand on her arm closed warningly tight, and she made herself smile and nod. It wasn't wise to make him angry. For all his surface jollity, the Shrek had a foul temper and nasty, inventive malice. So she let him fuss over her and tried to remain as remote as she could without antagonizing him. It was a tightrope she'd gotten used to walking, but it never got any easier. The Shrek looked around at the noisily chattering crowd and scowled.
"Look at them. Happy as the day is long, and not a brain between them. Eating my food and drinking my wine. And my poor niece is still a brain-burned savage, a maid to the iron bitch. They're happy enough to stuff their faces at my expense, but not one of them would agree to support me in trying to get my niece back, no matter how I pleaded. They don't know how special to me she was, just like you, Evangeline. But I'll get her back somehow, and have my revenge on those who refused me."
And as quickly as that, the clouds left his pudgy face, and he let go of her arm. It throbbed dully, aching from the fierce grip, but she didn't dare rub at it. It wasn't wise to distract him when he was in one of his good moods.
"Still, I expect great things of this wedding. Dear Letitia makes a lovely bride, and Robert Campbell is supposed to be a fine, upstanding young man. I've never had much time for the Campbells, any of them, but it must be said they have good connections with interesting and important people. And with our two houses united by this marriage, those connections should drop right into my lap. In return, all we have to do is watch their backs and protect them from unexpected attacks, while they jockey for position over the mass production contracts for the new star drive, some of whose revenues will undoubtedly end up flowing in my direction. Things are looking up, Evangeline. Soon I'll be able to give you all the splendid presents I always wanted to. You've been very patient with me, listening to all my promises and never complaining. But once our ship comes in, you shall want for nothing, my dear, nothing at all. And all I ask in return is that you love me. Is that so much to ask?"
"No, Father."
"Is it?"
"No, Father. You know I honor you as my father and show you all duty. My heart belongs to you."
Gregor Shrek smiled at her fondly.
"Oh, you look more like your dear mother every day."
Evangeline was still trying to come up with a safe and neutral answer to that one when they were joined by James Kasser, the vicar of the Church of Christ the Warrior. Tall and muscular, and positively radiating physical superiority, the vicar looked very smart in his jet-black military surplice, and didn't he know it. The Empress had given the Church her official support when she ascended to the Iron Throne, and the Church in return supported her with all its vast political power. It had followers throughout the Empire, and was now the nearest thing the Empire had to an official church. It named her Warden of the Stations of the Cross, Soldier of All Souls, and Defender of the Faith, and put its military training schools at her disposal. In practice, this meant the Church of Christ the Warrior had supplanted all other religions, in public at least, and its influence reached everywhere. The Empress excused the Church all taxes, allowed it to tithe its people as it wished, and used its Jesuit elite commandos to stamp out traitors in her name. So no one argued with the church much. Not in public. James Casser was a rising name in the church. He distinguished himself as a Marine for several years, stamping out the Empire's enemies with unyielding determination, whatever the cost. He rose rapidly to Major, and then heard the call and transferred to the church, where he turned his zeal to locating and persecuting all those who opposed the one true church. And if in his enthusiasm he sometimes strayed outside the law, or wiped out a few innocent bystanders along with the true targets, well, you can't make omelets, and all that. He was a rising star, so no one said anything. Or at least, no one who mattered. It was a great honor for the Campbells and the Shreks that he had agreed to officiate at this wedding, and he made sure everyone knew it. Lord Gregor bowed courteously to him, and Evangeline bobbed a curtsy.
"Good of you to honor us with your presence, your grace. I trust all is to your satisfaction?"
"Then you trust wrong. Never seen so many degenerates and parasites in one room before. A spell in the services would put some backbone into them. Doubt half of them have seen the inside of a church since they were christened, or could recite the Catechism of the Warrior if pressed. But as long as the aristocracy still cuddles up to the Empress, long may she reign, they can afford to cock a snook at the church. But that won't last forever."
Quite. May I offer you a glass of something?"
"Never touch the stuff. The body is a temple, and not to be defiled with noxious substances. I assume all the details for this wedding have been thoroughly checked out, Shrek. I have other engagements following this, and if I have to change my schedule, someone's going to suffer for it, and it isn't going to be me."
And that was when the wild-eyed zealot appeared with a crack of thunder in the middle of the ballroom, as though from nowhere. He wore only a ragged loincloth, and his bare skin was crisscrossed with old and recent scars. He wore a crown of thorns upon his brow, and blood ran down his face in sudden little rushes as his features moved. He had a starved, aesthetic look, and his eyes gleamed with the fire of the true fanatic and visionary. The stunned crowd started to react to his appearance, and then fell silent again as flames leapt up from nowhere, licking around the zealot without consuming him. He glared about him, and people shrank back, but when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly calm and even.
"I am here to protest against the continuing slavery of espers and clones. I protest against the desecration of the one true Church of Christ the Redeemer. Christ was a man of peace and love, but if he were here now to see what you do in his name, he would turn his face away from us in despair. I do not fear your guards or interrogators. I have dedicated my life to the Lord, and I give it up now as a sign to you that espers and clones have a strength and faith of their own, and will not be denied."
He paused then, looked around him, and smiled slightly.
"See you all in hell."
His body burst into flames, bright and searingly hot. Those nearest him fell back from the terrible heat, but in the heart of the flames, the zealot's smile never wavered, even as the fire consumed him. It was all over in a moment, and the flames and the heat died down to nothing. All that remained was a greasy stain on the floor, and a few ashes floating on the air, and a single discarded hand that had somehow fallen outside the devouring flames. It lay on the ballroom floor like a single pale flower, fingers outstretched as though in one last appeal for reason.
"Esper scum. Saved us the trouble of executing him. Pyrokinetic, obviously, but how did he get in here? I was assured this ballroom was protected by S-blockers."
"So it is."
Valentine Wolfe stepped forward.
"I am not entirely certain what has happened, but as Senior Wolf present, I can assure you that my security people are investigating the breach even as we speak."
"That's not good enough, Wolf."
Casser studied Valentine with undisguised contempt and disgust.
"Whether he teleported in or was smuggled in, he must have had inside help, which means you have a traitor here, Wolf. I'll detail a company of my men to help find him. They've had a lot of experience in finding traitors."
"Thank you, but that won't be necessary. My people are quite capable of doing all that's required without disturbing my guests."
It took the wide-eyed guests a moment to realize that Valentine had just refused the vicar permission to bring his hardmen in. This wasn't exactly unknown, but it was pretty damn rare. You upset the church at peril of your soul and your body these days. And James Kasser in particular wasn't used to being defied. His face reddened, and he stepped forward to glare right into Valentine's mascaraed eyes.
Don't cross me, boy. I shed no tears for one more dead Esper, but I have no tolerance for traitors, no matter where they may be found. And high station is no protection against the will of the Lord.
How very reassuring. Valentine said nothing more. The moment lengthened, and the tension grew. The vicar scowled at Valentine.
You look like a degenerate. Wipe that paint off your face.
Everyone stared at the two men, breathless in the spectacle of two legendary wills clashing. And then Valentine took one more step forward, so that his face was right before Kasser's. His crimson smile widened, and his dark eyes didn't waver at all. Lick it off. Kasser looked at him, his mouth a tight white line. His hand hovered over his sword, but he didn't draw it. If he did, and killed the wolf heir in his own home, he would be committing the church to full vendetta against Clan Wolf. Rich and influential as it was, the Wolves couldn't hope to stand against the full might of the church for long, but if the Wolves did somehow win the contract for the new star drive, and the church had to come cap in hand to Clan Wolf for the new starships, Kasser turned his back on Valentine and walked away, and everyone started breathing again. Valentine smiled at Gregor and Evangeline. My apologies for the unwelcome intrusion. My people will take care of it.
Damn Esper filth! If he hadn't killed himself, I'd have had him shot. We're too soft on Espers. You can't trust them.
They're still people, Father. Like clones.
Better not let the vicar hear you say that. The position on Espers and clones is quite clear. They exist only as the result of scientific progress, and are therefore property. The church won't even admit they have souls. Now, if you'll excuse me... He bowed low and turned and walked away. A murmur of quiet congratulations surrounded him as he moved through the crowd. The church had been putting pressure on all the families just recently over tithes, and was not as popular as it might have been among the aristocracy. Gregor waited until Valentine was safely out of earshot, then grabbed Evangeline by the arm again, squeezing hard till the pain made her gasp.
Never do that again. You must never draw attention to yourself with such views on Espers or clones. Neither of us could afford an investigation into your background. No one must ever find out about you.
He gave her arm one last shake, and then released her and stalked away, his face an angry red. People hurried to get out of his way. Evangeline put her hand to her aching arm, alone in the middle of the crowd. But then she always was. Evangeline was a clone, grown secretly by her father to replace the original Evangeline, who had died in an accident. His eldest daughter had been his favorite, and he couldn't bear to live without her. And, since no one had seen her die but him, he used a great deal of money and influence and had his dead daughter cloned. He taught her everything she needed to know, then cautiously released her into society, after a long but vague illness. She did well. She'd always been a quick study, or so her father told her. Everyone accepted her as the real Evangeline. They had no reason not to. But a single gene test was all it would take to reveal her true origin, damning herself and her father. Replacement by their own clone was the aristocrat's ultimate nightmare. She'd be destroyed, not executed, only people were executed, and her father would be stripped of his title and banished. She hadn't told Finley Campbell she was a clone, even though he trusted her with the secret of his other life as the masked gladiator. She hadn't worked up the courage yet. She loved him, she trusted him, but would he still love her if he knew she was only a clone? She liked to think he would, but... She smiled humorlessly. If she couldn't trust him with that, how could she tell him about her links to the clone and Esper undergrounds? That was, after all, why she turned off the wolf S-blockers, so that the elves could smuggle the zealot in. She knew her thoughts were drifting this way and that, but she didn't seem able to control them. She owed so many loyalties to so many people, her father, the Undergrounds, Finley, and failing any one of them could lead to her disgrace and death. She had to watch every word, every action, different lies for different people. Sometimes she just wanted to scream for everything to stop, for all the pressure to go away. But she couldn't. She couldn't afford to be noticed doing anything unusual. Occasionally she thought of killing herself, but then she always thought of Finley and how safe she felt in his arms. One day she would tell him. And then, one day. She looked up to see Finley casually approaching her, as though he just happened to be drifting in her direction. Her heart speeded up, and a betraying warmth flushed her cheeks. Finley stopped before her and bowed courteously, and she nodded coolly in return. Just two heirs to different clans, who happened to have met in a public place. Finley smiled at her, and she smiled back.
My dear Evangeline, you're looking very well. I trust the unfortunate incident with the Esper didn't upset you unduly?
Not at all, Finley. I'm sure Wolf Security already has things well in hand. You're looking quite splendid yourself. Is that another new outfit?
Of course. I do so hate to repeat myself. As one of the secret Grand Masters of fashion, I have an obligation to be innovative and shocking at all times. It's in my contract. Your hand is empty. Could I perhaps get you a small glass of punch?
Evangeline shook her head firmly. She'd seen the punch. It was bright pink, reportedly extremely alcoholic, and had bits of unidentified fruit floating in it. Some of them seemed to be slowly dissolving. And given that the punch had been provided by the wolves, there was always the chance Valentine had spiked it with something dramatic and disconcerting. Most of the guests had had the sense and foresight to bring their own drinks. Finley smiled and produced a delicately worked silver flask from an inner pocket. He removed the cap and poured her a generous drink. Evangeline sniffed it inquiringly, then grinned at the warm aroma of good brandy. She sipped it carefully and allowed her eyes to meet Finley's. She could feel her breathing quickening, and when she handed the cap back to Finley for him to drink, his fingers lingered on hers.
Now that our two families are to be joined in marriage, perhaps we shall have occasion to meet more often.
That would be most pleasant. I am sure we might discover some interests in common.
Right now, what you've got in common is a good stiff drink, and I'd kill for some.
Evangeline didn't need to look around to know who it was. There was never any doubt of Adrian Campbell's presence. Evangeline and Finley shared one last understanding glance, and then turned to face Finley's infamous wife. Adrienne pointedly held out an empty glass, and Finley filled it to the brim with brandy. She took a good gulp and nodded approvingly.
One of your few virtues, Finley. You're vain and shallow and have absolutely no idea how to treat a lady, but you do know your booze. Evangeline, my dear, haven't seen you to talk to in absolutely ages. That's a very striking outfit you're wearing. Do feel free to come to me for advice on style and presentation at any time.
She held out her glass to Finley for a refill, and he obliged without comment. Adrienne's capacity for drink was legendary, even in a court noted for its excesses. She smiled nastily at her husband over the glass.
Good brandy, Finley. I like my booze like I like my men. Strong, mysterious, and tempting.
Really? I wouldn't know.
Damn right you wouldn't.
Adrienne looked back at Evangeline, who had to fight to keep from flinching.
It's time you were looking for a husband for yourself, my dear. Your father monopolizes your time far too much. Husbands can be boring, irksome, and a general pain in the ass, but you have to have one if you want to get on in society. Personally, I wouldn't be without one, especially when it comes to picking up the tab. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really ought to have a word with our nervous bride and groom. Someone has to tell them the facts of life.
And who better than you?
Adrienne smiled.
Quite.
She stalked off through the crowd, opening up a path for herself through sheer strength of personality. Her intended prey didn't even realize she was coming. The groom, Robert Campbell, was currently being supported and encouraged by his cousin Finley's brothers, William and Gerald Campbell. Robert's father had been the Campbells' younger brother, who died 3 months previously in an accident the family still didn't like to talk about. Mostly because it was so damn embarrassing. In order to keep Robert and his branch of the family from becoming a laughingstock, a marriage had been hastily arranged that would serve the dual purpose of establishing Robert in society and helping to close the gap between the Campbells and the Schrecks. And of course, if something should go wrong, Robert was the most expendable member of the family at present. He was average height, as fighting fit as years of military training could make him, and at 17, old enough to marry, but not old enough to object to the marriage. He was still trying to get used to how much his world had changed. One moment the Schrecks were a deadly enemy to be fought on every occasion, and now here he was marrying one. But he was old enough to understand politics and know his duty, especially since William and Gerald kept explaining it to him. William Campbell was tall, thin, and intense, and the bookkeeper of the family. It was a job that couldn't be trusted to an outsider, but which most members usually avoided like the plague, on the grounds it was far too much like hard work. And if they'd wanted to work, they wouldn't have been born aristocrats. Fortunately, William found numbers both more interesting and easier to deal with than people, so he was perfectly suited to the job. He didn't get out much, but he meant well, and occasionally surprised people with his firm grasp of politics. He was a Campbell, after all. Gerald, on the other hand, was the family mistake. There's one like him in every family. Too dumb to be entrusted with the important stuff, but too senior to be just ignored. The family had been trying to find a place for him all his life, with absolutely no success. Gerald was tall, blond, and handsome, and a complete bloody disaster no matter what he did, and everyone knew it but him. The Campbell himself had been heard to say, only partly in jest, that the best thing to do with Gerald would be to make a gift of him to a family they were really mad at.
"Do try and at least look cheerful,"
said William to young Robert.
"This is a wedding, after all, not the dentist's."
"Right,"
said Gerald.
"At the dentist, they take something out. Here, you get to put something in. Get my drift, eh? Huh?"
Robert smiled politely and just a little desperately. He had the look of a small animal caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. He pulled at his frock coat to straighten it and fiddled with his cravat. His dresser had assured him he looked both dignified and fashionable, but he wasn't sure of either. He felt very much he could have used a stiff drink or several, but William wouldn't let him. Valentine had offered to slip him a little something, but he declined. He didn't think he was ready to deal with one of Valentine's little somethings. Probably no one but Valentine was.
"You've been through the rehearsals. Nothing to worry about. Just say the words, kiss the bride, and it'll be all over before you know it. Remember, you have to lift the veil first, though. You'd be surprised how many people forget that. Sometimes I think we're getting a little too inbred. Brace up. Not long to go now. And then you can settle down to getting to know your bride. Something to look forward to, eh? Gerald, go get Robert a drink."
"But you said he shouldn't have any."
"Then go and get me a drink."
"But you don't drink."
"Then go and get yourself a bloody drink, and don't come back till you've drunk it."
Gerald blinked a few times, and then moved away in the general direction of the punch bowl, looking just a little confused. As always. William looked at Robert and shrugged.
"Don't mind your Uncle Gerald, boy. He means well, but he should have been dropped on his head as a baby. It's not entirely his fault that he's about as much use as a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest." "Is there anything you want to ask me before the ceremony? I mean, I am a married man." "That's all right. A lot of people have already talked to me about that. Everyone's been very free with their advice. The only advice I could really use is how to get out of this."
William smiled and shook his head.
"Sorry, but that's not on. Duty calls. The Campbell sets the rules, and we have to follow them. If we didn't, where would we be? In complete bloody chaos, and all the other families would charge in like sharks scenting blood in the water. Or do they taste it? I've never been sure. Anyway, whatever else we may be, we're Campbells first, always. If it's any help. I felt much the same before my wedding, and I've been happy enough, I suppose.
Keep on encouraging him like that, and we'll have to drive him to the altar with whips.
Robert and William Campbell looked up to see standing before them Adrienne Campbell, large as life and twice as loud. William flinched visibly and was still trying to find the right words with which to introduce Adrienne when she stepped forward, brushing him aside, and smiled at Robert.
Hello, Robert. I'm Adrienne, Finley's wife. I'm the one you've probably been warned about, and you should believe every word. Mostly they're trying to keep me away from public functions on the grounds I embarrass them. Personally, I've never been embarrassed in my life. Fortunately for you, they couldn't keep me out of a wedding this important. You come with me, dear. There's someone I want you to meet. Did you want to say something, William? No? I didn't think so. You rarely do. Come along, Robert.
And she took him by the hand in a vice-like grip and led him off through the crowd. Robert went along with her. It seemed like the safest thing to do, if he ever wanted his hand back. They passed through the outskirts of the crowd, followed all the way by scandalized whispers, and then through a side door that led into a quiet sitting room decorated with antiques of considerable age and complete hideousness. And there, among the antiques, like a single flower in a garden of weeds, sat Letitia Schreck, his bride-to-be. She jumped up the moment they entered, then stood quietly with eyes modestly downcast. She was 16 years old and very pretty, with hints of a more mature beauty to come. The long white wedding gown made her look very fragile, like a delicate porcelain figure, standing alone on a shelf. Robert looked at her, and then at Adrienne with something like shock.
I know. You're not supposed to meet before the ceremony, but they'll overlook it this time rather than have me make a scene in front of everybody. They tend to overlook quite a lot rather than have me make a scene. I can be very good at scenes when I put my mind to it. Anyway, I brought you two together so you could talk, so get on with it. I'll run interference at the door. You've got about 20 minutes before they come and drag you off to the ceremony, so make the most of them. Just chat together. You'll be surprised how much you've got in common.
And with that, she disappeared out the door, pulling it firmly shut behind her, leaving Robert and Letitia standing looking at each other. It was very quiet in the room. They could hear the murmur of raised voices beyond the closed door, but that might as well have been on another world. For a moment, that seemed to last forever, neither of them moved. And then Robert cleared his throat awkwardly.
Would you like to sit down, Letitia?
Yes, thank you.
They sat down on chairs facing each other, careful to maintain a proper distance between them. Robert searched for something to say that wouldn't make him sound like a complete idiot.
Letitia.
Tish.
I beg your pardon?
I prefer to be called Tish, if that's all right.
Yes, of course. Call me Bobby, if you like.
They looked right at each other for the first time, and Robert smiled suddenly.
Tell me, Tish, do you feel as uncomfortable in your outfit as I do in mine?
Letitia put her hands to her mouth, looking at him to check he wasn't shocked. Reassured by his smile, she lowered her hands and smiled back at him.
I hate this dress. If it was any tighter, it would be inside me. I haven't dared to eat or drink anything. I don't think there's anywhere for it to go. And every time I go to the toilet, I have to take 2 maids with me to unlace everything. I've been going rather a lot. I think it's nerves. And of course, if I say anything or try to complain, they just say it's traditional, as if that solved everything.
Right. If I hear the word tradition one more time, I think I'll scream. I was told I was getting married about 6 hours ago. How about you?
Same here. I suppose they thought if they gave us too much time to think about it, we'd run away or something.
They weren't far wrong. This isn't at all what I thought I'd be doing when I got up this morning. If I'd known, I'd have headed for the horizon so fast it would have made their heads spin. Of course, that was before I met you. I thought, well, I don't know what I thought, but you're all right.
Thanks. You really know how to compliment a lady, don't you?
Robert grinned.
Well, actually, no. I've been a military cadet most of my life. It's expected for those in the family unlikely ever to inherit. You don't get to meet many women in military training. How about you? Did you have anyone special in your life?
There was someone, but that's all over now. They found out about us and stopped us seeing each other.
Letitia smiled wryly.
He was one of my bodyguards. I'm not allowed out much either. Not since the Empress started raiding the families for maids. I knew poor Lindsay, the Shrek's niece who disappeared. She was so bright, so funny. Nowadays they keep us under guard as much as possible. Understandable, I suppose, but it makes for a very quiet life.
Robert nodded.
And now here we are, about to get married. It's going to seem strange having lifelong enemies as my in-laws.
Same here. Do you Campbells really eat babies for breakfast?
Oh, every day. Beats the hell out of bran flakes.
Maybe we'll bring our families together like we're supposed to. Stranger things have happened. Bobby?
Yes, Tish?
If I have to marry someone, I'm glad it's someone like you.
Same here, Tish. Same here.
She put out her hand, and he took it gently, enfolding her small, slender fingers in his. And they sat there, smiling together, for an endless moment. And then Adrienne came bustling in.
All this time, and you've only got as far as holding hands. I don't know what's wrong with you young people these days. I'd have had him pinned up against the wall by now. But time's up, I'm afraid. Finlay sent me to fetch you, Robert. Urgent family business, and your presence is required.
Robert gave Letitia's hand one last squeeze and got to his feet.
Family business is always urgent, especially when it's inconvenient. I'm glad we had this chance to talk, Tish. I'll see you shortly.
Bye.
Letitia blew him a kiss. Robert snatched it out of midair, put it in an inner pocket over his heart, and only then allowed Adrienne to lead him away. It turned out to be quite a family gathering, all squeezed together in a side room, with guards outside the door to make sure they wouldn't be disturbed. Finlay was there, at his most outrageously foppish, studying Adrienne through his pince-nez as though she were a stranger. William and Gerald were arguing quietly but heatedly, barely stopping to nod to Robert as he closed the door behind him. He took in their earnest faces, and his heart dropped. Something bad was in the wind. He could feel it. Finlay cleared his throat, and everyone looked at him.
The Campbell himself cannot be here in person. He's had a communication from our allies on Shub. It came via a series of espers, so we're pretty sure it wasn't intercepted. It seems that some other house has discovered our connection with Shub.
Wait a minute. Hold everything. What's this about Shub? What allies have we got on that hellhole?
You have a right to know, now that you're to be a central part of family business. But you cannot discuss this with anyone outside the family, not even your wife. No one must know. Our existence as a house depends on this. For some time now, we've been secretly intriguing with the rogue AIs on Shub, in defiance of Empire policy. The enemies of humanity have been passing us designs for advanced technology to help us win the contract for mass production of the new star drive, in return for us making the drive available to them. They are desperate to remain the Empire's equal, and we need to contract. Our finances are somewhat depleted at the moment.
To be exact, we're in deep shit. If we don't get the contract, we're ruined, bankrupt.
William winced, but nodded.
We must win the contract if we are to survive as a clan. Everything depends on it.
Anyway, it appears someone has found out. They can't have any definite proof yet, or they'd have turned us into the Empress, and we'd all be facing a quick trial and a lingering execution.
Can you blame them? We're working with the AIs on Shub. They're dedicated to wiping out humanity in its entirety, and we're giving them the new star drive? Is it just me, or is this completely bloody crazy?
Please don't shout. This has all been discussed and decided at the highest clan levels. We have absolutely no intention of giving them the drive, whatever happens. We are ambitious and desperate, but not, as you say, crazy.
In the meantime, it's vital we find out who knows our secret. That's why you're here, Robert. We're already running several clandestine operations to discover our enemy, and you're uniquely suited to investigating the Shreks. But you're not to discuss this with your wife. She may be marrying into the Campbells, but for now she's still a Shrek. Use her, but don't trust her. Don't look so shocked, dear. This is family business, and the family always comes first.
It's important we discover how much our enemy knows. Anyone who knows too much must die. The safety of the clan is at risk.
What's the Campbell doing?
Said Gerald anxiously.
Why isn't he here? He should be making these kind of decisions, not us.
He's busy reassuring the AIs through the Esper link. We don't want them doing anything impulsive or unfortunate. We're only valuable to them as long as our connection remains a secret. He took a hell of a risk sending a messenger here, but it was important we know immediately. From now on, we don't go anywhere without guards, and no one is to go off on their own. Our new rival might try to kidnap one of us to pump that person for information and put pressure on the rest of us. You're especially at risk, Robert. You're not as used to this game as we are. We can't put you in seclusion right after your wedding. That would look just a little suspicious, like we had something to hide. But from now on, you and your new wife will have a double security presence. If she asks why, point out how easily that Esper zealot broke in. Now, let us return to the celebration before our absence becomes a talking point. Smiles and laughter, everyone. No point in putting weapons in our enemies' hands. After all, it's not certain they know that we know they suspect. You're looking puzzled, Gerald. Don't let it worry you. Just stick close to us, and if you feel like saying anything, rise above it. William, keep an eye on him. If he opens his mouth, stamp on his foot.
Adrienne looked at Finley thoughtfully.
Since when did you become such an accomplished conspirator?
Finley smiled at her dazzlingly.
It's in the blood, my dear. I am a Campbell, after all.
He took Robert by the arm and led him back into the crowded ballroom. Everywhere faces smiled and heads bowed, and Robert nodded numbly to them all. Some weren't really there, of course. Attending in person was a compliment and a privilege. The less well-connected usually had to settle for sending a holo. If nothing else, it helped to cut down on duels. Nothing like a wedding to bring out old family quarrels. Robert thought about that to keep from thinking about anything else, but it didn't work. He pulled his arm free of Finley and gave him a hard look.
Just how much danger are we in, Finley? How much danger am I putting Letitia in by marrying her?
Not much more than she's already used to. She's a Shrek, after all, and they have a history of intrigue that makes us look timid. Now, forget about all that and concentrate on your wedding.
James Casser, vicar of the Church of Christ the Warrior, called the gathering to attend him in the kind of voice usually reserved for a parade ground, and the two families separated out to form two groups, so that they could look down their noses at each other. They left a narrow aisle between the two groups, and almost before he knew it, Robert was heading for the aisle, surrounded by Finley and William and Gerald, all looking very stern and respectable. The bride was brought forward to walk beside him, surrounded by women of the Shrek family. Letitia arrived amid a crowd of whispered jokes and comments and stifled laughter, but Robert's companions stayed straight-faced, as custom required. Robert was grateful for that at least. He had a strong feeling that just at this moment, even a bad joke would collapse him into howls of hysterical laughter. And then he and Letitia were walking down the aisle side by side, alone at last, both looking straight ahead and concentrating desperately on the moves and words they'd learned at rehearsal. They came to a halt before Casser, resplendent now in a purple gown, who bowed curtly and began the wedding service in a calm, businesslike tone. Personally, Robert preferred it that way. It made both the vicar and the service seem less awe-inspiring. The words were familiar from any number of family weddings Robert and Letitia had attended since childhood, and they made their responses in calm, dignified voices. Everything went smoothly, and Robert even remembered to raise the veil before he kissed her. All that remained was the ceremonial tying of the knot. Casser gestured for the page boy to bring forward the ceremonial golden cord on its platter. He wrapped the cord loosely about both their wrists, binding them together, and then called forward the church esper. Before the church could give its blessing, and thus validate the marriage, it was important that both parties were proved to be who they said they were. Nobody ever said the word clone, but it was never far from anyone's mind. Many of the guests stirred uneasily. The ESP blockers had been shut down for this moment, and the threat of outside attack was that much greater.
but mostly the guests were concerned that their own little secrets might be detected and exposed by the Esper. Everyone had something to hide. They needn't have worried. The Esper knew better than to let his thoughts stray. There was a church guard standing off to one side with a gun trained on him. So he concentrated on the bride and groom before him, and everything was hushed. Until his head came up sharply, and he stepped back a pace. Casser glared at him.
What is it? Is there a question of identity?
No, Your Grace. They are who they claim to be. It's just that I sense not 2 minds, but 3. The Lady Letitia is pregnant, and not by the groom.
For a moment, there was a shocked silence, and then uproar filled the ballroom. Robert stared open-mouthed at Letitia, who stared numbly back at him. Had there been someone special, he'd asked, and she'd said yes. Casser tore the golden cord from their wrists and threw it to one side. It seemed like everyone was shouting and screaming at everyone else, and swords were appearing in hands. Space grew around the white-faced bride as people fell back rather than be contaminated by her presence. Adrienne tried to get to her, but was held back by the crush of the crowd. For bringing a sullied bride to a joining of clans, the Shreks would be ostracized by society. It was the ultimate insult. The Shreks were yelling that they knew nothing of it, but no one was listening. Robert started toward Letitia, not knowing what he was going to say or do, only drawn on by the misery in her face. And then Gregor Shrek burst out of the crowd, the golden wedding cord in his hands. His face blazed with fury, and Letitia shrank back from him. Before anyone knew what he planned, he had the golden cord round Letitia's throat and pulled it tight. Her eyes bulged as she fought for breath, and she clawed helplessly at the Shrek's wrists. He swung her round, put his knee in her back, and tightened his hold, the muscles standing out in his arms. Robert plunged forward to stop him, but then strong arms were holding him back, no matter how he struggled. William and Gerald held him firmly, their faces cold and dispassionate. Letitia's face was horribly red, and her tongue protruded from her mouth. There was shouting and some screaming from the crowd, but no one went to help her. Robert fought savagely, but William and Gerald held him fast. He called her name, and didn't know he was crying. Letitia sank to the floor, held up only by the Shrek's strangling grip. The ballroom slowly grew silent as the end drew near, until the only sounds in the chamber were Gregor's panting breath, Letitia's last choking gasps, and Robert's racking sobs. And then her eyes rolled up, and she was silent, and Gregor slowly relaxed his grip. She fell limply to the floor and lay still. Gregor turned to face Finley, his face red from his exertion, his breathing unsteady.
I make apologies for my clan, and present this death as atonement. I trust this is sufficient?
It is. Honor is satisfied. We will discuss the choosing of another bride at a later date that the wedding may proceed in the future. This ceremony shall be forgotten and never referred to again.
He nodded to William and Gerald, who released Robert. He stumbled forward to kneel at Letitia's side. Finley gathered up the rest of the Campbells with his eyes and led them out of the ballroom. The Shreks followed, and the Wolves, and finally the vicar James Casser and his people, until only Robert Campbell was left, kneeling by his dead bride, holding her still white hand in his. Outside in the corridor, Gregor Shrek looked across at his favored daughter, Evangeline. Let her take a lesson from this. He'd kill her too if he had to keep his secret safe. He'd done it before. He smiled slightly. He'd murdered the original Evangeline, because she wouldn't love him as he loved her, as a man loved a woman. He was the Shrek, and he would be obeyed. Going underground. The trouble in dealing with underground movements, thought Valentine Wolfe waspishly, is that sometimes they take the name too literally. He struggled on through the narrow service duct, shoulders hunched and head down, to keep from banging it on the low tunnel roof. It stretched endlessly away before him, cramped and gloomy and unreservedly depressing. Low-intensity lamps hung down from the roof at regular intervals, providing just enough light to make him squint painfully. An insane tangle of interwoven cables stretched along the walls and ceiling, color-coded in a way that presumably made sense to someone. He was deep in the guts of the world, in its hidden underside, the maze of sewers and access tunnels and service ducts that linked the varying self-contained worlds that existed within Golgotha. Although the complicated maze was necessary for the inner world's survival, few people ever thought of them. Only service personnel were authorized to use the passageways, but then Valentine was used to being in places he wasn't supposed to be. His lip curled in disgust as the slime he was treading in grew steadily deeper. It was already lapping at the ankles of his very fashionable thigh-length leather boots and was doing nothing at all for their shine. Valentine didn't know what the slime was, and didn't feel in the least like investigating its nature. He discarded the frailer parts of his outfit before setting out, replacing them with more robust and anonymous items, and wrapped himself in a long black cloak. He'd wiped the heavy makeup from his face, tied back his long hair in a functional braid, and together with his new outfit he presented a quite different appearance, which was just as well. It wouldn't do for anyone to discover Valentine Wolfe attending meetings of the Clone and Esper undergrounds. They wouldn't understand. It was a shame he'd had to rush away so soon after the wedding debacle. He'd expected a dull and lifeless affair, followed by appalling food and worse dancing, but in the end it had turned out to be rather amusing. He stopped suddenly and peered suspiciously about him in the gloom. He wasn't that far from one of the main sewer offshoots, according to the map he'd memorized earlier. There were all kinds of stories about what strange and malignant creatures flourished in the sewers. Also, according to rumor, sewer workers received battle pay and bonuses for the heads of anything they brought back with them. Not that Valentine ever listened to such stories. He looked round sharply, sure he'd picked up something just at the edge of his hearing, but there was only the silence and the gloom. He concentrated, and deep within his body, drug caches dumped their loads into his systems. His breathing quickened and deepened as his metabolism speeded up, ready for action. He was stronger, faster, sharper now, and more than ready for whatever was out there. He grinned broadly. Let it come. Let them all come. A light flared suddenly in the gloom ahead of him, sharp and distinct after the blue-white glare of the lamps, followed by the faint sound of footsteps splashing through the slime. Valentine's smile widened, and he drew his gun. A dark figure appeared in the tunnel ahead, silhouetted against the light. It stopped a respectful distance away, calm and silent, a ball of glowing clear white light bobbing at its shoulder. The figure looked human, but Valentine wasn't in the mood to make allowances. In fact, he felt rather like shooting it anyway on general principles. And then the figure spoke in a calm, collected voice that had the flat perfection of a machine, computer disguised to prevent identification.
I didn't mean to alarm you, good sir, but you'll understand that in our position it pays to be cautious, if not downright paranoid. Allow me to give you the first part of the current password. New.
Hope. Rather an obvious choice, I would have thought, but then no one asked my opinion. May I ask who you are?
The figure moved slowly forward, taking its time so that Valentine wouldn't feel threatened. It finally came to a halt before him, bent almost in two under the low roof, and Valentine's interest increased as he realized that any identifying signs were concealed inside a long, flowing cape. Even more interesting, there was nothing inside the cape's hood. No face, no head, nothing at all. The ball of light bobbed cheerfully at the figure's shoulder, bright and clear, and Valentine had to tone down his vision.
I am Hood, coordinator between the Clone and Esper undergrounds and the Cyberats. And you, sir?
Valentine Wolfe, patron and advisor to the undergrounds. I've heard of you, Hood. The shadow in the background, the presence behind the throne, so to speak. I and the rest of the patrons are required to reveal our identities. The Espers insist on it. But you alone are allowed anonymity. I wonder why.
Because I'm valuable to them, and as long as they need me, they indulge me. I've heard of you, Valentine, but then I suppose everyone has. You've pumped quite a lot of money into the undergrounds by all accounts, but I have to say I can't see why. You are heir to the Wolf clan. You stand to inherit everything. What on earth do you need that you have to come to the undergrounds to get it?
Sorry, I never tell everything on a first date.
As you wish. I wonder what the undergrounds want this time that such important backers as you and I had to be summoned so urgently.
It had better be important. I feel quite naked without my usual persona. Shall we go?
Of course. It's not far now. After you.
Oh no. After you. The Cape's hood bobbed once in what might have been agreement or humor, and Hood turned and led the way down a side tunnel that, if anything, smelled even worse. Valentine followed close behind, his gun still in his hand. He flushed most of the drugs from his system, but kept a few in reserve, just in case. Normally, the underground only summoned its patrons one at a time, so that if they were captured, they wouldn't be able to identify anyone else. Something important must be in the wind for two to be needed. Valentine studied Hood's enigmatic back thoughtfully. The lack of a face was interesting. The underground was almost fanatical in its need to know exactly who it was dealing with. It could be a holographic disguise, but nothing less than an S-blocker would protect Hood's thoughts from an Esper's probing mind, and the underground wouldn't tolerate that for a second. Hood, a supplier of money, reportedly well connected, he worked well with both the clone and Esper undergrounds, which was rare. They didn't trust easily, and there were few indeed who'd earned the trust of both. As if to underline that thought, Hood and Valentine came to a sudden halt before the first warning sign. It was a dead man hanging from the ceiling like a broken puppet. Its arms and legs had been smashed, with white points of splintered bone protruding from the bloody flesh. The corpse slowly raised its head to look at Hood and Valentine, and its eye sockets were empty. Blood spilled down the colorless cheeks like thick crimson tears. It opened its mouth, and maggots poured down its chin.
Go back. Go back now.
Valentine looked at Hood.
Be honest, would this scare you if you were a crack squadron of the Empress's guards?
Not really, but then I've seen it before. They insist on running this routine even when they know it's me. I think they just do it for the practice.
The dead man scowled at them.
Turn back. I mean it. I'm not kidding.
Oh, shut up. I've seen scarier things than you in my daydreams.
He probably has. This is Valentine Wolf. The Valentine Wolf.
The dead man disappeared between one moment and the next. The smell stayed pretty much the same, though. The empty Hood looked at Valentine.
They've heard of you.
Valentine smiled.
Everyone's heard of me. Can you hear something?
A low roar began from somewhere behind them, building steadily in volume. The tunnel floor vibrated under their feet. Thick ripples surged across the surface of the slime. A growing pressure built in the air, like the wave of compressed air that precedes an underground train. The roar grew louder, and the floor shook. Valentine looked quickly about him, but there was nowhere to run except further down the tunnel. The roar was deafening now, the pressure of the air flat and heavy against his face. Hood was standing very still, as though frozen in place by shock. Then, a vast wave of rushing water came bursting through the tunnel toward them, thundering forward like a runaway train.
They've opened the damn sewers! Grab hold to something or we'll be swept away!
The tidal wave loomed up before them, filling the tunnel, and then it was gone. No water, no noise, nothing at all. The air was quiet and calm and undisturbed. Valentine let his breath out slowly.
You bastards.
A voice in Valentine's head crowed triumphantly.
Got you. I don't just do corpses, you know.
Hood shook his head slowly.
We did ask for it, didn't we?
Just practicing. I never get to do anything down here. No one comes for ages. I don't know why we bother keeping a watch. Go straight ahead and take the second left. Meeting's just ahead. You're expected. And tell them I could do with a drink.
There was a lot Valentine felt like saying, but he didn't. He had his dignity to consider. He looked at Hood.
You can't get good help these days.
It never pays to underestimate Espers. They know everything you're thinking.
Oh, I doubt that. Anyone who enters my mind does so at their own peril after all the things I've done to it.
Good point. How did someone like you ever get involved with the underground in the first place?
Valentine smiled.
My experiments with various unusual substances led me to rumors of a new, very experimental drug that could make an Esper out of anyone, even from those with absolutely no family history of psionics. If there is such a drug, I want it. Esper is one of the few experiences still unknown to me. Just the thought of something so new and vital makes my mouth water. I must have it. Pursuit of this drug brought me to the elves in the underground, and for the first time I realized what a potential power base they represented. With their help, I could attain heights of power I would never otherwise have dreamed of. The Espers will break free eventually, Hood. It's inevitable. They are the wave of the future, the next evolutionary step for humanity. And I intend to ride that wave as far and high as I can. Who knows, it might even carry me to the Iron Throne itself. Now, wouldn't that be something? Of course, I'd have to kill my father and family first. I'm quite looking forward to that.
He stopped talking suddenly. It seemed to him that he was saying entirely too much to someone he barely knew. He didn't know why, but spilling his secrets to a comparative stranger definitely wasn't like him. He took out his silver pillbox, took out a tab, and pressed it against the side of his neck, over the vein.
Just a little something to wake me up.
He smiled broadly as the jolt kicked in.
Tell me about yourself, Hood. What brought you into our little world of treason and subterfuge?
I was part of the security force responsible for tracking down and eliminating the Cyberats. But the more I learned of them, the more I grew to understand and then envy their unrelenting search for truth and freedom. The Emperor stays in power because her people control information, regulating how much we're allowed to know about anything. You can't protest against a thing if you don't know it's happening. Most of what we know is based on lies and distortions. The Cyberats show me parts of the world I've never seen before. And having seen, I couldn't close my eyes again. My growing contacts with the Cyberats led me to the underground, and the more I learned of their struggle, the more I sympathized. It took me a long time to convince all the various elements of my sincerity, but my connections with the Empress's own security forces made me an invaluable ally. I have proved my worth. So the man who once hunted rebels now works to protect them. Such is life. I've always felt a little irony was good for the blood. I'm intrigued by your interest in the Esper drug. I assure you it's very effective.
How do you know?
Because I took it. I volunteered. In fact, I insisted. I'd seen so much I'd never seen before, and I wanted to see even more. The results were interesting. Minor telepathy, some projected imagery, similar to what we just saw in the tunnel. I'm no match for a born Esper, but I see deeper and more clearly now than I ever did before. Theoretically, stronger doses of the drug should produce stronger effects, but there have been unfortunate side effects in others who have tried the drug.
Valentine smiled serenely.
That's part of the thrill of experimenting with a new drug, the risks and discoveries. Though I do wish they'd stop changing the meeting place. Every time I have to walk a little further and pass through even more disgusting scenery to get there.
Hood shrugged.
Basic security. Keep moving, keep looking over your shoulder, and keep everyone else off balance. The Empress has a lot of people trying to find the underground, and they've got a much bigger budget than we have.
Technically speaking, this isn't actually the underground. We're not that far from the surface, just in between the inner and outer spheres. I think they just call it the underground to confuse people.
Understandable. And you must admit, saying you're part of the underground sounds a lot better than saying you're one of the in-betweenies.
Valentine smiled politely, and they walked a ways in silence. They both knew that by now unseen minds were probing theirs to make sure they were who they were supposed to be. They also knew that if either of them had even looked like failing the test, they'd be dead. Nothing was allowed to threaten the underground. Valentine and the man called Hood rounded a corner, ducked under a low entrance, and stepped out of the cramped tunnel into a brightly lit giant cavern of gleaming metal. Hood's ball of light snapped out. Multicolored wires crawled across the walls, hung dangling from the high ceiling, and disappeared into conduits like snakes sliding into their holes. Mysterious bulking machinery jutted out of the walls, crowding each other for space. The floor was covered with debris, smashed and broken pieces of high tech, some recent, some apparently not. There were living things in the center of the floor, but Valentine chose not to look at them just yet. He straightened up slowly with a grateful sigh, and massaged his aching back with both hands.
You're the tech expert, Hood. Where the hell are we this time? Looks like a repairman's nightmare.
An old workstation by the look of it. Abandoned and forgotten and renovated by the Severats. There are lots of places like this between the various worlds within Golgotha. Places that served a purpose once, but were left behind as technology moved on. The Severats love them, play with them for hours. They've got hundreds of refuges like this. They don't appear in current computer records anymore.
It's a dump.
Well, yes, but you have to admit it does smell better than the sewers.
Actually, I quite like dumps. They appeal to my preference for chaos. I love the patterns they make.
He giggled cheerfully, and Hood looked at him. Valentine looked back, and then the two of them walked forward to bow courteously to the Esper representatives in the middle of the great metal chamber. As always, the representatives hid their true identities behind telepathically projected images. They might have been there in person, or they might have been sending the images from somewhere else. It was a talent that Valentine greatly envied. The Esper leaders were a mystery, and they were determined to keep it that way. So a waterfall fell through the air, bubbling and gushing, coming from nowhere and going back there when it touched the floor. Strange colors came and went, and two shadows that might have been eyes hovered midway. Beside the waterfall, a swirling mandala hung upon the air, an intricate pattern of glowing lines twisting and turning in upon itself endlessly. Valentine could have watched it for hours. Next to that, a 12-foot-long dragon lay curled around a tree, light gleaming dully on its golden scales. Valentine was never quite sure whether that was one representative or two. He'd never heard the tree say anything, but then the dragon didn't have much to say either. And finally, there was the individual Valentine always thought of as Mr. Perfect. A massively muscled figure, developed almost to the point of caricature. He stood with his arms across his massive chest, staring commandingly at his visitors. Valentine always felt an overwhelming urge to sneak up behind him and goose him. Except he probably wasn't really there. There was no guarantee anyone was. The images could be coming from anywhere. They had no reality outside the recipient's mind. Valentine was familiar with that feeling. It occurred to him that Hood might be seeing something completely different. He'd have to compare notes later. He'd been quietly trying to piece together some idea of who was behind the images for some time, but to no effect. The Esper representatives were extremely paranoid about their secrets, and with good cause. The reward for Esper rebellion was death. Eventually. The cavern was silent, but the air was tense and brittle with the unspoken speech of the telepaths. Hood leaned in close beside Valentine.
I can just about tap in on what's going on. Listen through me.
A sharp prickling wrapped around Valentine's head like a halo of barbed wire, and slowly he became aware of a soft susurrus of voices filling the chamber. They meshed and intersected without colliding, 100 voices speaking all at once, without confusion or loss of meaning. The voices were more than just words. Thoughts and feelings and impressions rolled around each other, adding tartness and flavor. And underlying the music of gathered minds, the hard, unyielding beat of 6 major minds, conferring, directing, and deciding. Valentine's mind swayed with the rhythm, but held itself apart and intact. The impact would have been too much for the normal human mind to cope with, but Valentine's mind wasn't normal anymore. Not after all the things he'd done to it. He hung on the fringes, savoring what he could, fascinated. If this is what the Esper drug can do, I want it. And to hell with what it costs me. He sensed as much as heard Hood's laughter beside him. And then Hood moved away, and the link was broken. Valentine rocked on his feet, shrunk once again to the narrow margins of his own mind. faint traces of the experience remained with him, leaving him hungry for more. Valentine smiled wryly. Presumably that had been Hood's intention, to get him off balance and at the same time concentrate his attention on ways of getting the Esper drug for himself. Except Valentine knew all about drugs, and bowed to none of them. He had other business here besides the Esper drug. The underground was a route to power, and that came first. Always. He looked round sharply as 4 men with the same face entered the chamber from another entrance. They wore carefully distinct clothing, but they moved in the same way, and their faces held the same thoughts. Clones, presumably representatives for the clone underground. They were tall and slender, almost impossibly graceful, and had a natural gravitas that went beyond dignity. Valentine knew a natural leader when he saw one. Whatever they were all here to discuss, it must be pretty damned important. The clone leaders rarely appeared in person. They were followed in by 3 women with the same face, and Valentine's interest was piqued. He'd seen that face before, seen it on an Esper called Stevie Blue, who died at the Empress's feet after humiliating her in front of the whole court with a pie in the face. She'd been an elf, Esper Liberation Front, the more extreme edge of the Esper underground. And now it seemed she was a clone as well. That was unusual. Not many Espers survived the cloning process. The 3 women looked to be in their early 20s, wearing the same leather and chains their dead sister had worn, not to mention the same T-shirt, bearing the legend, Born to Burn. They were short and stocky, with muscular bare arms, and one of them was casually hefting a solid steel dumbbell as though it weighed nothing. Long dark hair fell to their shoulders, full of knotted ribbons. Their faces were sharp, high-cheekboned, and daubed with fierce colors. They each wore swords on their hips and leather scabbards that looked like they'd seen a lot of use. The 3 women looked cold and calm, and very dangerous. Mr. Perfect greeted them.
"Welcome, Stevie Blues. You honor us with your presence. As Espers and clones, you are uniquely suited to bring the 2 undergrounds together."
"Even though neither of us can be sure where your loyalties really lie,"
said the dragon, a long, thin tongue flickering out of his mouth.
"Save the flattery and the paranoia,"
said one of the Stevie Blues.
"We're here to talk. Let's get on with it. Some of us have a life outside the underground."
"Freaks and perverts,"
growled the flowing Mundala.
"Group marriages such as yours are forbidden among clones."
"We're elves, first and foremost. We fight for freedom. All kinds of freedom. Want to make something of it?"
Roaring flames suddenly licked up around the 3 elves, and the heat drove everybody back a step. It didn't affect the Stevie Blues. They were pyros and immune to their own fire. The clone representatives frowned severely, making it clear this was nothing to do with them. The waterfall began to steam slightly, and the dragon shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Perfect's face was turning red. Maybe he was present after all. Valentine grinned, enjoying the show.
"Well,"
said the 3rd Stevie Blue, glaring at the Mundala.
"You have anything further to say?"
"Not at this time."
The elves' fire snapped off, and everyone breathed a little more easily.
"Can't we leave you people alone together for 10 minutes?
said a new voice, and everyone turned to look. All around the walls, view screens were flashing on as the cyber-rats made their appearance. Computer hackers, techno-freaks, teenage rebels with any number of causes. Like the Esper representatives, they hid their true faces behind computer-generated images. Cyber-rats faced death or reconditioning if caught, but for them, the lure and possibilities of the computer system was just too much to resist. Most of them had no interest in politics or rebellion, outside of wanting to be left alone, but the shared danger provided a common ground with the clone and Esper undergrounds. Cyber-rats were unpeople, hiding behind fake IDs and a multitude of names, organizations, and corporate identities. They lived like rats in the walls of the state, foraging for what they needed when no one was looking. Ghosts haunting the machine, just for the hell of it. They helped fund the underground through various scams and computer frauds, and used the opportunity to vent their spleen on the authorities who persecuted them. There were a great number of ways to make someone's life miserable through computers, and the cyber-rats knew all of them. After all, they'd invented most of them. The Esper and clone representatives looked severely about them at the grinning faces covering the walls and maintained a dignified silence. Long experience had taught them they couldn't win with the cyber rats, who spent most of their time engaged in wars of words with each other. A few voices jeered at the representatives and then were distracted by the last of the arrivals. The aristocratic backers had finally turned up, fashionably late, of course, stepping out of the entrances as though just entering the chamber was enough to soil their clothing. Valentine smiled at them, and they bowed briefly in return. There were only 3 of them. Most of the aristocrats who, for one reason or another, backed the underground, preferred to do so discreetly and at long distance. On the whole, they funded the underground as a means to political power. Mostly younger sons who weren't going to inherit, or at least not fast enough to suit them, and therefore had to look for advancement where they could. They wore no disguises. The underground didn't trust them any further than they could spit into the wind with their mouths closed, and were determined to know exactly who they were dealing with, if only so they could get them later if things went wrong. The aristocrats went along with much bad grace. It wasn't as if they had a choice. You only came to the underground when there was nowhere else to go. Evangeline Schreck he knew from before, and her appearance here was no surprise. A fervent supporter of the clone underground in recent times, for reasons which remained obscure. David Deathstalker was a new face. He'd inherited the title after Owen was outlawed, and didn't look any too pleased about it. Only 17 years old, a minor cousin, unused to the hothouse intrigues of the imperial court. Tall, immaculately dressed, and possibly not as nervous as he appeared. Handsome enough to set a few hearts fluttering at court, but young enough not to know that yet. Or maybe not. He was a Deathstalker after all. He'd acquired the title by default. Owen had no brothers or sisters. The supposedly genetic quirk that gave Deathstalkers the boost also killed most children before they reached maturity. The family considered it an acceptable risk. No one ever asked the children what they thought about it. So far, David's motivations seemed clear enough. He wanted to avoid being outlawed like Owen, or executed like Owen's father, and was smart enough to know he had absolutely no allies at court. The Deathstalker name had become synonymous with treason and bad luck, and most people were keeping well clear in case it rubbed off. The third phase held Valentine's interest the longest. Kit Summerisle, called by some Kid Death, who murdered his own family in the name of ambition, only to find himself alone, trusted neither by the court nor any family. A mad dog who'd slipped his leash. Presumably Kit was there as a backer of the underground because no one else would touch him. The Empress had played with him for a while, but Kit had to be wise enough to know that wouldn't last. He was too dangerous, a sword that might just as easily turn on anyone who tried to wield it. Kid Death, the smiling killer, resplendent as always in his armor of black and silver. He looked very young, with his pale face and flyaway blonde hair, but the icy blue eyes were very old. They'd seen enough death for a dozen lifetimes, and loved every minute of it. Valentine stepped forward and bowed courteously to Evangeline Schreck. "Dear Evangeline, so good to see you again. Pity about the wedding, but that's life. Or rather, death. Your father always did have a propensity to overreact."
That's one way of putting it. You look quite different without your face on, Valentine. Almost human.
A mere illusion. He turned to the young Deathstalker and bowed again, not quite as low. "I've not had the pleasure, I believe, sir. David, isn't it? I know who you are. And it's pronounced David, actually." "As you wish. But I fear you too must learn to come when the underground calls, however they pronounce your name. There's no room down here for the airs and graces we allow ourselves in society. That is, after all, part of the charm of treason. There are no rules here, no required behavior, no one to make us kneel or bow the head. We are equal here, and all they ask of us is a willingness to fight, and if need be, die for the cause."
"Then why are you here, Valentine? You never cared for any cause save your own continuing self-destruction."
Valentine took his time turning, and smiled at Kid Death. "Where better to see death or transformation than in the midst of rebellion? There's only one place on Golgotha more dangerous than the underground, and that's the arena. And that's always seemed too much like hard work for me. I'm really rather delicate, you know."
You have the constitution of an ox. Your system has to be in top form to put up with all the things you do to it.
I know why he's here. He wants the drug. The Esper drug. Trust me, Valentine. If you did get it, you wouldn't like it. You'd find out what everyone really thinks of you.
Valentine smiled dazzlingly. You already know what everyone thinks of you, dear Kit, and it hasn't slowed you down any.
I want to know why Hood is allowed to hide his face,
said David.
We weren't allowed to, even though it meant having to expose our faces in front of brain-damaged cases like Valentine and Kid Death.
How unkind. No one appreciates a true artist. Kid Death looked steadily at David.
You really must learn to choose your words more carefully, Deathstalker. You never know when they might be your last.
David looked at him defiantly. His hand was very near his sword.
You don't frighten me, Summer Isle.
Then he should. I've seen you both fight, and he'd win. Now, if you two have both finished shaking your genitalia at each other, perhaps we could hear Hood answer the question about his anonymity. Personally, I'm all ears.
Kid Death and David Deathstalker looked at each other, and David looked away first. Valentine studied him thoughtfully. Perhaps the young Deathstalker wasn't as naive as he seemed. The Summer Isle was a psychopath, and everyone knew it. If he were to turn those cold eyes in Valentine's direction, Valentine had every intention of bowing low and backing down, and then possibly dropping a little something special in the Summer Isle's drink at some future time. He looked across at Hood as he realized the silence had lengthened, and Hood still hadn't answered the question. The man without a face stood very still, the empty interior of his hood as enigmatic as ever.
I am valuable to the underground and the cyberrats. They indulge me rather than risk losing what I provide.
And what might that be?
You don't need to know.
But we insist.
David and Kid Death moved unhurriedly toward Hood, taking up positions on either side of him so that he couldn't face them both at once. Their hands were very near their swords.
That's enough,
snapped Mr. Perfect, and everyone turned to look. The Esper representative glared at them all impartially.
We did not summon you here to squabble like children in a playground. We have business to discuss, and the longer we stay here, gathered together in one place, the more danger we put ourselves in.
Damn right!
One of the Stevie Blues strode forward to take up a position in the center of the chamber, hands on hips.
Security would just love to get the drop on us because we were too busy arguing among ourselves to hear them coming. Everyone stops messing about right now, or my sisters and I will start banging heads together. You can call me Stevie 1. My sisters are 2 and 3. Don't get us mixed up or we'll hit you. We pride ourselves on our individuality.
There was a general relaxing and moving away by all those present. Stevie 1 nodded to Mr. Perfect to take over. David sniffed at the 3 clones.
I didn't know there were any Esper clones left alive. I thought they were all wiped out and further experimentation forbidden.
Lots of things are forbidden. But they still happen if there's profit to be made. As I understand it, the Stevie Blues were a secret military experiment in cloning battle espers. Didn't work out. Most of the subjects died, and the survivors were too powerful, too uncontrollable, unpredictable. Word about the experiments got out, and the Empress was furious that she hadn't been consulted. Gave the order to close everything down. The Stevie Blues were marked for execution, but they escaped. The elves took them in, gave them a purpose in life and a shape for their revenge. As both espers and clones, there was supposed to be a link between the 2 undergrounds, but no one seems too sure where their true loyalties lie. Perhaps even they're not sure.
Fair enough. I still want to know why Hood hides his face.
Oh, tell him,
said the dragon,
or we'll be here all night.
I am highly placed in the Empress's retinue. I have her trust inasmuch as she trusts anyone. I am not ready to endanger myself by revealing my identity to those who don't need to know. The underground indulges me because I discovered the Esper drug. None of us can afford for the Empress to learn about that. They get the secret out of me eventually. They always do. My identity remains a secret because it is in all our best interests. Now, we have business to discuss.
Then get on with it. What exactly is so important that we had to be dragged here at such short notice and at such an ungodly hour?
We have a plan. We elves have placed one of our own in the water purification department. Through him, we have unlimited access to the water supply network for the whole of Golgotha. We propose to introduce the Esper drug into the water system. I'm told a really small amount, as little as 1 part per million, would be enough to have an effect on anyone who drank it or even had contact with the affected water. No one would notice its presence until it was far too late. No one knows it exists but us, and unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, the Esper drug would just blend in with all the other drugs in the water. It's pumped full of happy drugs and tranquilizers as it is, to keep the common herd quiet. With millions of Espers suddenly appearing overnight, the Empress would have no choice but to recognize Espers as full citizens, with full privileges. After all, most of her subjects would be Espers, along with most of her own people. Who knows? Maybe we'll get really lucky and she'll get a surprise in her drink too.
There was a long pause as everyone took it in turn to look at each other. The Stevie Blues smiled at each other smugly.
You have got to be joking. You're crazy.
Oh, I don't know. I rather like the sound of it myself.
You would. Anyone who is anyone drinks off-world bottled water. Only the lower classes drink tap water, and the Empress would rather wipe out every single one of them on this planet than be dictated to.
Nicely put. Didn't think you had it in you, David.
David.
Don't push it, Deathstalker.
Look, the Esper and Clone Undergrounds have been fighting for self-determination for almost 3 centuries. And what have we to show for it? Nothing but increased security on all levels and greater controls over the Clone and Esper populations. The elves emerged out of a need to strike back, to take the attack to the enemy. This would be a blow against the Empress's authority that couldn't be hidden or hushed up. A whole planet full of Espers couldn't be ignored. They'd be too valuable just to be wiped out. Right,
said Stevie 3. There was a flood of approval from the cyber rats on the surrounding view screens. They were always up for a little orchestrated chaos and mayhem, and they admired audacity. They'd always been troublemakers first and rebels second. The various faces on the screens began shouting advice and support, and then started shouting at each other to shut up, until finally one of the Esper representatives had the sense to turn the volume right down. The cyber rats raved silently on, oblivious to the fact that no one was listening to them anymore. They were used to that.
You're still carefully overlooking the main objection. According to the figures I've seen, the Esper drug kills 20 to 40% of those who take it. If we gave it to the entire population of Golgotha, how many innocents would die for our revenge?
None of them are innocent. They're all a part of the system that brutalizes us. They're happy enough to profit from our pain. Right. When have they ever cared for us?
Stevie 1 glared at Evangeline.
What do you think we should do? Commit suicide in public as a protest like that poor fool you smuggled into the wedding? What difference did it make? No one gave a damn. They don't care if an Esper or a clone dies. We're just property. They can just replace us. It's not like we were people. Do I need to stand here and tell you horror stories of the way we've been treated to justify our plan? We've all lost someone dear. It's barely a year since Dram and his butchers attacked our base in New Hope. That was supposed to be our first step forward, out of the darkness and into the light. Espers and clones and normals, living together in harmony. A living example of the way things could be. And then the attack sleds came falling out of the sky, opening fire without warning. Hundreds of thousands died as the city burned. Men, women and children. Espers, clones and normals. There was nothing we could do but run for our lives. It took us a year to rebuild the underground, and now all the normals are too scared even to be seen with us. Every chance we had for peaceful coexistence died with New Hope. All that's left is the elves and the armed struggle. Did our friends die for nothing? Have you forgotten the screams bursting through our minds, blinking out one by one, like candles caught in a storm?
Revenge,
said one of the male clones, and everyone turned to look. The 4 men had been quiet so long, everyone had forgotten they were there.
Revenge is all elves ever want. We want peace, freedom. We have to learn to live with the normals because it's their universe, their empire. One day it might be ours, but none of us will live to see it. Pardon our paranoia, but we can't see how a planet full of traumatized espers mourning their dead would do anything to further the clone cause. The Empire would waste no time in blaming the undergrounds. We'd be branded mass murderers, and they'd be right. Everyone would turn against us, even the new espers. He's got a point. I really don't think I can go along with this.
No one asked you, David. You don't understand what we're talking about.
Presumably you have some interest in our opinions, or else why were we called here? The shimmering Mundala spoke.
We value your input. We are unable to decide. It occurred to us that perhaps we are too close to the question. Hopefully you will help us see the wider issues. The Esper drug could be the means to our finally winning the war. Or it could damn us all forever. Talk to us, all of you. We must decide.
There's still a lot we don't understand about the drug. We were understandably intrigued with the thought of what the drug would do to someone who was already an Esper. We hoped it might produce the super Esper we've been searching for, someone strong enough to overcome the effects of the S-blocker and free us from its control. We had many volunteers.
So, what happened?
They all died,
said the dragon.
Some were killed outright. Some went insane and then died. Some tore out their own eyes because of what they were seeing. It would seem we're not ready as a species to become super espers. We must continue to rely on our cyber rat friends to come up with a technological answer.
They've been promising a breakthrough on that for years. We're tired of waiting. This drug is our chance to strike back at those who've hurt us. We can't wait. How long can it be before some traitor in our organizations gets hold of the formula and hands it over to security? Just because we're espers, it doesn't mean we can't be fooled. We must use the drug now, while we still have the advantage of surprise. Right. Who cares about a few dead normals?
We care,
said one of the male clones.
Our argument has always been that we are not just property, we are humans too. We will not risk that humanity by becoming responsible for mass slaughter.
You've always been dreamers. We can't live with normals. They're too different.
They seem to have managed quite successfully on Mistworld.
Yeah, well, from what I've heard, it's a right hellhole. I wouldn't live there if you paid me.
We're drifting away from the subject again. It seems to me there are still too many unanswered questions about the Esper drug. Firstly, we can't be sure of a mortality rate of just 20 to 40% when dealing with such a large dose. It could turn out to be much higher. Word would get out eventually as to who was responsible. That's inevitable. And then the normals would hate us as never before. Secondly, I think getting the drug past all the checks and filters would prove to be a great deal harder than you've been assuming. One man on his own couldn't hope to oversee everything. I think we should ask the cyber rats to run some computer simulations first. In the meantime, I think we'd do better to concentrate our efforts on bringing influential people to see the justice of our cause. The real war will be fought and won in the hearts and minds of people everywhere. After all, the Empress can't live forever. Perhaps a coalition of the right people could even replace her in the future.
Right, a coalition. You'd love that. With you at its head, no doubt.
We have heard enough.
The dragon stretched slowly, light rippling across its golden scales.
Evangeline Shrek has provided the voice of reason, as always. We do not reject the idea outright, but it is clear that much more research must be undertaken before we can commit ourselves. The matter is now closed.
And that was when everything went to hell in a hurry. An alarm sounded, loud and strident, and over it came the sound of energy guns firing. All around the walls of the chamber, the cyber rats vanished from the view screens as they dropped out of the system. For a moment, there was only the hissing of blank screens, and then they cleared one by one to show rapidly changing views of armed guards running through the approach tunnels. They were everywhere, filling the tunnels, firing their disruptors at unseen Esper resistance. Whatever the Esper sentries were doing, it didn't seem to be slowing the guards down any.
Why aren't they using illusions to stop the guards? I thought that was what they were there for.
Look at the screens. They've got S-blockers. Look at the uniforms. Those are Imperial guards, the Empress's own. She knew there'd be important people here. And then everyone was shouting at once and trying to outshout everyone else. David Deathstalker and Kit Summerisle had their guns and swords in their hands, but only Kid Death looked ready to use them. Hood was looking from one screen to another, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Evangeline had gone very pale, but her hands had clenched into fists. She looked at Valentine, who smiled and made helpless motions with his hands. Behind his flustered facade, Valentine was thinking fast. He had any number of battle drugs ready to drop into his system at a moment's notice, but he was reluctant to throw away his carefully established persona until he absolutely had to. It wouldn't do for word to get out that he wasn't the useless type he'd always pretended to be. People might start wondering what else he'd been hiding. On the other hand, he couldn't afford to be taken prisoner by the guards for much the same reason. He decided to wait and see how much danger he was really in. And then the Esper representatives vanished between one moment and the next, and the air rushed in to fill the space where they'd been.
The bastards! They've teleported out and left us to die!
There were 6 entrances giving out into the chamber, none of them big enough for more than 2 men to pass through at a time. The Stevie Blues covered 3 of them, psionic flames leaping menacingly from their hands. Kit moved to cover another, and gestured for David to take the next. Kid Death was grinning broadly. David looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else, but his eyes were calm and his mouth was firm, and he held his sword and his gun as though it was the most natural thing in the world. He was a Deathstalker after all. That left one opening gaping unattended. Hood was still frozen in place before the screens. Evangeline started toward the entrance as though she might break into a run at any moment, but Valentine stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Don't. Trying to run would be a really bad idea. Look at the screens. The guards have got all the escape routes covered, and at the moment they're shooting at anything that isn't them. There's nowhere to go."
You don't understand. I can't afford to be caught.
Valentine raised an eyebrow. "I think you'll find that's true for most of us. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd better guard that entrance." Evangeline looked at him.
You? What are you going to do? Bribe your way past the guards with handfuls of drugs?
"Oh, I'll think of something. Besides, there's no one else, is there?" Evangeline looked at Hood, still rooted to the spot, and looked away.
Give me a knife. I won't be taken alive.
Valentine studied her for a long moment, then drew a long stiletto from his boot and handed it to her. She accepted it with a nod of thanks and moved over to stand beside Hood and watch the screens. Valentine moved unhurriedly over to the gaping entrance. He was still thinking hard. He'd put a lot of time and effort into his usual persona, and now it seemed he was going to have to throw it away. As usual, man proposes, and the Empress disposes. And then a thought came to him, and he smiled. He didn't know what he was so worried about. The odds were he was going to die anyway. The thought cheered him, and he checked the contents of his pillbox for something special. Some of the guards were in for a very unpleasant surprise. The first armed men rounded a corner and found themselves face to face with Stevie 1, guarding the entrance. They raised their guns, and the Esper hit them with a blast of white-hot flames. The guards screamed as the blazing fire filled the tunnel, sucking the air from their lungs as it crisped their flesh. More guards appeared in the adjacent tunnels, only to meet Stevie's 2 and 3. They summoned up fire, and the leading guards died horribly. Evangeline watched them die on the view screens, and wouldn't let herself look away. The remaining guards came to a halt in the tunnels as word of the deaths got to them. They were waiting for something.
They're bringing the S-blockers forward! I can feel them getting closer! My flame's already beginning to die down!
More guards spilled into a different tunnel, only to find Kid Death waiting for them. He shot the first men with almost lazy precision, and then put the gun away and waded into the guards, swinging his sword double-handed. In the narrow tunnel, they could only come at him 2 at a time, and that was no threat to Kid Death. He laughed as he worked, a light, breathy, and altogether horrible sound. David Deathstalker boosted, and all his worries fell away. The guards were no match for him either. But there were so many of them, and neither Kit nor David had any illusions about their eventual fate. If the guards had only had more guns, it would have been over by now. And then Evangeline shouted and pointed at the view screens, and Valentine heard a familiar roar deep in the tunnels. He looked back at the screens and grinned broadly. The guards in the tunnel heard him laughing, and then they heard the roar building behind them and turned to look. A wall of rushing water came thundering toward them, filling the tunnel from floor to ceiling. For a moment, Valentine thought it was the illusion again, a last-ditch defense by the Espers, but even as he thought that, he knew it had to be genuine. All those Espers were dead or blocked by now. The water was real. And up on the view screens, the pounding waves smashed into the guards and swept them away. They never stood a chance. Valentine moved back to stand with Evangeline and Hood and watch the guards die on the screens. The water carried them along like leaves in a flooded drain, hammering them against the sides of the tunnels, and then pulling them on. A few tried to grab at the tunnel supports, but the pressure of the water was too much for them, and there was no air anywhere. They drowned, quickly if they were lucky, and their dead bodies bobbed limply in the surging tide. David and Kit cut down the last of their opponents, then looked around confused for more. David was panting and shaking as he fell out of boost, but his face was full of exhilaration. Kid Death was smiling gently, not even breathing heavily. But they both had the same look in their eyes, the same satisfied pleasure, and they saw it in each other like a secret shared. One of the Stevie Blues whooped with joy, and the other two joined in.
The S-blockers have been destroyed or swept away. I can't feel them anymore. We're safe.
Not necessarily. Valentine pointed at the view screens. All that water is heading our way, and there's nothing here to stop it. They all saw it on the screens and backed away from the entrances. The pounding of the water was louder now, like a never-ending roll of thunder, and they could feel the pressure of its coming on the air, its awful weight vibrating through the chamber floor. On the view screens, dead guards tumbled through the rushing water like so many blank-eyed dolls. Everyone backed away from the entrances, coming together in the middle of the chamber because there was nowhere else to go. They watched their death coming on the screens, and no one had anything to say. The Stevie Blues held hands, and Evangeline held Valentine's arm. He smiled briefly and let her. Then the tidal wave slammed into an invisible barrier and fell back, thwarted. The water churned on the view screens, pounding this way and that, but couldn't enter the chamber. The air shimmered, and the Esper representatives were suddenly back in the chamber. Mr. Perfect smiled at their surprise.
You didn't really think we'd just abandon you, did you?
If I wasn't feeling so good, I'd kill every damn one of you. And I might anyway on general principles.
Damn right. I must have aged 20 years in the past few minutes. Mind you, on me it looks good.
The two men laughed together companionably. The Stevie Blues were laughing too. Evangeline noticed she was still holding Valentine's arm and let go. He bowed to her courteously. Hood was slowly shaking his head.
You'd think by now I'd be used to Espers and their devious ways. I assume you have some way of draining the water out of the tunnel so we can leave?
Of course. It shouldn't take long, and then you can all go.
I should be careful where you tread, though, said Valentine Wolfe. You never know what you'll find in the water these days. The man called Hood walked unhurriedly through the quiet corridors deep in the heart of the Empress's palace. They were broad, high-ceilinged corridors, with tasteful paintings and portraits on the walls by whoever was currently in fashion. Hollows were so gauche. People came and went on silent, important missions, passing Hood by without noticing him. The same low-level Esp that hid his face among Espers was more than enough to keep him hidden from normal people he didn't want to see him. He wasn't actually invisible, he just gave their minds a little nudge, and they looked everywhere except at him. Luckily, S-blockers were rare and expensive enough that they were only used in actual rooms, not in the connecting corridors. A serious security lapse that Hood had taken care never to point out. Never knew when you might need an ace up your sleeve, particularly when dealing with the Empress. Lionstone had raised paranoia to an art form, and encouraged its growth among her people. Hood also carried a small tech inhibitor that kept his image from appearing on any of the security monitors. A simple device that triggered a program he'd entered into the security computers, which in turn edited him out of the image appearing on the monitors. The device reminded each camera as he approached, and then made it forget him once he was past. No trouble at all for someone with his access to security computers. He ducked this way and that, and never said a word, until finally the door to his private chambers was shut firmly behind him, and he could relax at last. He removed his cape, threw it more or less in the direction of his coat rack, and let out a long, happy sigh. Home and safe. Or as safe as he ever was. He sank into a comfortable chair and stretched slowly. Living a double life was a tiring business. He smiled and dropped his Esp disguise, and there in his chair sat the Lord High Dram, warrior prime of the Empire, and head of the Empress's security. Right-hand confidant and lover to the Empress Lionstone herself.
"Talk to me, Argus,"
he said, and sank back in his chair, with his eyes closed as his personal AI brought him up to date on everything that had happened in his absence. Dram had many enemies, most of whom knew where he lived, and he relied on the AI's unsleeping vigilance to protect his quarters while he was away.
"Are you sure you got everything?"
"Reasonably sure."
"What does that mean?"
"It means if I have got it wrong, at least you won't be around to say I told you so."
Dram laughed in spite of himself. He allowed the AI to be rude on occasion. He felt it was good for his character.
"Someone wishes to talk to you, sir."
"I don't feel like talking to anyone right now. You deal with it."
"It's the Empress, sir."
"Why the hell didn't you say so?"
Dram sat up straight in his chair, immediately wide awake again.
"Never mind. Put her on."
The wall to his left became one large view screen, filled with the Empress Lionstone's Arctic features. She looked thoughtful. Dram didn't like the look of that. Lionstone was never more dangerous than when she'd been thinking. He stood up, bowed respectfully, and smiled warmly into the chill of her blue eyes.
"Lionstone, my dear. An unexpected pleasure. What can I do for you?"
Come to my private quarters, now. There's something we need to discuss.
The large room was crammed with furniture, paintings, statuettes, all of them unique. And everywhere drinks and drugs and sweet things for every palate. In private, Lionstone was something of a pig. She was sitting in a grand chair carved from the shimmering metal of one of the living metallic trees on Unseelie, watching new weapons trials on a wall screen. She seemed utterly intent on the orchestrated mayhem, and didn't spare him so much as a glance. Dram moved over to stand beside her, and the maids, crouched at her feet, stirred uneasily. It was programmed into them that he was the only man permitted near the Empress, but they didn't like it.
"I hear you raided the underground earlier today. Catch anyone interesting?"
It was a debacle. And don't tell me you haven't already heard all the details. I know I should have discussed it with you first, but I only heard about the meeting at the last moment, and it seemed too good a chance to miss. I should have known better. Someone talked. They were waiting for us. Most of my men are dead, and we don't have a single prisoner to show for it. Some days things wouldn't go right if you paid them.
Dram came up behind her and took her in his arms. She stiffened immediately.
No, Dram. It's time for talk, not affection.
Dram held her a little tighter and buried his face in her neck.
"Are you sure?"
Dram, shut down.
The control word slammed through his head like a long roll of thunder, and his arms fell limply to his sides. He was helpless to do anything but stand where he was and wait for her to give him back control of his body. Lionstone pushed herself away from him, turned round, and slapped him deliberately across the face twice. There was real strength in the blows, and blood trickled down his chin from a split lip. He took it because he had to. Mind techs had implanted certain controls in his mind. Lionstone believed in covering all the angles.
Next time I tell you something, do it. Or I'll use a command word you don't even know you've got, and they'll hear your screams on the surface. Dram, release.
His body was his own again, and he nearly fell. His arms and legs were shaking with reaction, but he forced himself to bow courteously to Lionstone. She nodded easily in return.
That's better. You know you're the only person I can really relax with. You should feel flattered.
"I feel a lot of things, but I don't think flattered is one of them. And if you knew what I was thinking, you'd never feel relaxed or safe again. I've been programmed against harming you, but there's a way around every program, if you look hard enough."
Dram smiled at Lionstone to show he was a good sport, and she smiled back. Dram kept his face carefully calm and neutral. His thoughts, at least, were safe in here. He could feel the presence of the S-blocker hidden somewhere nearby. It was just a general precaution. She didn't know about his ESP. If she had, she wouldn't have rested till she got the formula of the drug out of him, by whatever means necessary. Unless, of course, she already knew about it.
The aliens are coming, Dram. 2 species we know nothing about, except that their technology is almost certainly superior to ours. The whole Empire is in danger, and I'm damned if anyone or any group of people are going to interfere with whatever I feel is necessary to protect my Empire. So I'm going to declare an Empire-wide emergency and assume emergency powers. Both Parliament and the Company of Lords will back me rather than risk a civil war in the face of the oncoming alien threat. They're more scared of them than they are of me. Or they will be once my propaganda people have released carefully edited information about the aliens. If I'd known how useful such a threat could be, I'd have manufactured one long ago.
And what part am I going to be playing in all this? You didn't summon me here at this hour just to make speeches at me.
Dear Dram, so direct and forceful, you remind me of me. You're going to go to the underground in your hood disguise and convince them that now is the right time to rise up in rebellion against me. You will then supply me with all the necessary details in advance, and my forces will be there waiting for them, with far superior numbers and firepower, and with you in charge as yourself. Most of the underground will be trapped and slaughtered, and the surviving espers and clones will be rounded up and killed or controlled. I'd like to wipe them out en masse, but with a war coming, we can't afford to throw away good resources. But for the same reason, they're too important and too dangerous to be left running around loose any longer. Yes, setting you up as Hood was one of my better ideas.
She doesn't know about the drug. She doesn't know everything.
They looked at each other for a long moment, Lionstone smiling, Dram doing his best to look pleased and respectful.
Well, if that's business out of the way...
Control your hormones. We're not finished yet. We still have to discuss that most despicable traitor, Owen Deathstalker. I had him outlawed specifically so he could lead us to the lost Dark Void device, but things seem to be getting out of hand. Not only has he discovered the whereabouts of Lost Hayden with its army of augmented men, he's also joined up with the legendary Jack Random. I would have sworn he was dead, but the man is harder to kill than a cockroach. Still, all is not lost. The Deathstalker is on his way to Chandracore, along with our carefully planted traitor, where, all being well, he should find the final information on the device's location. If we're going to take on 2 new alien species with superior technology, I want that device. And I wouldn't say no to the Haydenman army either, if we could be sure of controlling them. Certainly I can't afford to have that army and the device in someone else's hands. Your traitor had better come through, Dram.
Don't worry, they'll never suspect my agent. Once Owen has located the device, I'll know, and my men will close in and get there first. The Deathstalker's been very lucky so far, but the Dauntless blew the hell out of his ship as he was taking off from Mistworld. It'll get him to Chandracore, but no further. And then Owen and his people will be ours for the taking, along with everything they know.
Mistworld. That hellhole has been a thorn in my side for far too long. I want those espers. I want them tamed and humbled and under my control, along with all the other rebels who thought they could defy me. And if that's not possible, I want them all destroyed so they can't be used against me.
They'll come to heel fast enough, once we've got the Dark Void device.
The Empress looked at him.
Once we've got the device. Don't start getting cocky, Dram. You might be my consort, but you'll never be Emperor. The device will be mine, to do with as I please. And on that day, no one will ever dare stand against me again.